In the clearing illuminated by the blood moon, I encounter a scene of unspeakable horror. Broken bones and shredded remains cover the ground. The air vibrates with the approach of something monstrous, and I know I'm about to join the previous victims. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe. Also, write now in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. All of this because, as I steered my old Ford pickup along the winding mountain road, an unsettling silence descended upon the forest. The usual chirping of birds and rustling of leaves seemed to have vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness that made me question my decision to spend the weekend alone in this remote cabin. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt path. I'd been looking forward to this getaway for months. After a grueling quarter at work, I desperately needed some time away from the chaos of Denver. When my buddy Mike mentioned his family's cabin in the Colorado Rockies, it seemed like the perfect escape. "You'll love it, John," Mike had assured me, slapping me on the back. "No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just you and nature. It'll do wonders for your stress levels." Now, as I navigated the increasingly treacherous road, I wasn't so sure. The isolation that had seemed so appealing back in the city now felt oppressive. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing unease. "Get it together, Harris," I muttered to myself. "It's just a weekend in the woods. What could possibly go wrong?" As if in answer to my rhetorical question, a massive shape darted across the road about 50 yards ahead. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something tall and dark disappearing into the underbrush. It moved with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I peered into the woods, but whatever I'd seen was long gone. Probably just a bear, I tried to convince myself. But deep down, I knew bears didn't move like that. Shaken, I drove the remaining mile to the cabin at a crawl, my eyes constantly darting to the tree line. When I finally pulled up to the small clearing where the cabin stood, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The old wooden structure loomed before me, its weather-beaten exterior a testament to years of harsh mountain winters. As I stepped out of the truck, the cabin creaked ominously, as if settling under my gaze. The musty air carried a hint of something wild and unfamiliar, a scent that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my duffel bag and cooler from the truck bed and approached the cabin. The porch steps groaned under my weight as I fished the key out of my pocket. It took a few tries to work the old lock, but finally the door swung open with a protesting squeal. Inside, the cabin was just as Mike had described, rustic and cozy, with a small living area, a basic kitchenette, and a loft bedroom accessible by a ladder. A layer of dust covered every surface, and cobwebs adorned the corners. I dropped my bag and set about opening windows to air out the musty smell. As I unpacked my supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes were constantly drawn to the darkening woods outside the window. More than once, I caught myself holding my breath, straining to hear any unusual sounds over the creaking of the old cabin. "You're letting your imagination run wild," I chided myself aloud, hoping the sound of my own voice would dispel the growing tension. I busied myself with settling in, determined to enjoy my hard-earned solitude. I was in the middle of preparing a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, when a sudden crash in the distance made me jump, nearly knocking the pot off the small propane stove. My heart raced as I rushed to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. The forest was still, no sign of what could have caused the noise. "Just a falling branch," I said, trying to convince myself. "These old trees, they drop limbs all the time." But the explanation felt hollow, even to my own ears. As night fell, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. Every shifting patch of darkness could be hiding something sinister. I found myself double-checking the locks on every door and window, testing their strength against some unnamed threat. I tried to distract myself by reading one of the dog-eared paperbacks I'd found on a dusty shelf, but I couldn't focus on the words. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling or a distant, unidentifiable sound from the forest. Around midnight, I finally gave up on relaxation and decided to turn in for the night. I climbed the ladder to the loft, settling into the lumpy old mattress. Sleep, however, proved elusive. Every time I started to drift off, a noise from outside would jerk me back to alertness. A snapping twig, a rustling in the underbrush, sounds that could be perfectly innocent but in my heightened state seemed fraught with menace. In the early hours of the morning, I finally fell into a fitful sleep, plagued by dreams of dark shapes moving just beyond my field of vision. I tossed and turned, tangling myself in the musty sheets as my subconscious grappled with the unease that had been building since I arrived. A loud thud jolted me awake. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. The loft was pitch black, but I could sense something was wrong. The air felt different, charged with a palpable tension. I held my breath, straining my ears. There it was again, a heavy footstep, too loud to be a deer or even a bear. It sounded like it was circling the cabin. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Each footfall sent vibrations through the old wooden structure, making the floorboards creak in sympathy. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty lower level of the cabin. Everything was as I'd left it, but that only heightened my fear. The threat was outside, unseen but undeniably present. Another step, this time accompanied by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to resonate in my very bones. This was no bear or mountain lion. The sound was too deep, too powerful. It spoke of something ancient and primal, something that had no place in the rational world I thought I knew. I wanted to run, to flee this isolated cabin and never look back. But terror kept me rooted in place, barely daring to breathe as the creature continued its circuit around my temporary refuge. I clutched the flashlight like a talisman, its beam darting from window to window, dreading what I might see but unable to stop looking. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, the footsteps finally receded into the forest. I remained frozen in the loft, unwilling to believe it was truly gone. Only when the cabin was filled with the pale light of early morning did I find the courage to descend the ladder on shaky legs. I approached the nearest window, steeling myself for what I might find. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth around the cabin, were footprints. Massive, inhuman footprints that dwarfed my own. They formed a clear path around the structure, silent testimony to the night's terrifying visitation. As I stared at the impossible evidence before me, I knew with chilling certainty that my peaceful weekend getaway had turned into something far more dangerous. Whatever had stalked the cabin during the night was still out there, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of my ordeal. With trembling hands, I began to gather my things, no longer caring about relaxation or solitude. All I wanted now was to get back to civilization, away from whatever creature lurked in these woods. But as I looked out at the dense forest surrounding the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving might not be as simple as I hoped. The true test of survival, I feared, was yet to come. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin sent chills down my spine. For a moment I thought I was still trapped in the nightmare of the previous night, but as I became fully alert, I realized with growing horror that this was all too real. The footsteps were impossibly heavy, each one causing the cabin to shudder slightly. Whatever was out there was massive, far larger than any animal I knew to inhabit these woods. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag on the cabin floor, where I'd relocated after the terrifying events of the night before, afraid that even the slightest movement might attract the creature's attention. As suddenly as they had started, the footsteps ceased. The ensuing silence was almost worse, filled with the weight of anticipation. I strained my ears, trying to detect any sign of the creature's presence, but all I could hear was the frantic beating of my own heart. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before I finally mustered the courage to move. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but the no service message mocked me from the screen. I was truly alone out here. As the pale light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I cautiously approached one, peering out into the misty forest. At first I saw nothing unusual, just the dense trees and underbrush surrounding the cabin. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft mud around the cabin, were footprints. But these were no ordinary animal tracks. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with a distinct humanoid shape that defied explanation. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling as it tried to process what I'd seen. "This can't be real," I muttered to myself, running a shaky hand through my hair. "This has to be some kind of joke. Maybe Mike set this up, trying to scare me." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The fear I'd felt, the sounds I'd heard, those couldn't be faked. Something was out there, something that shouldn't exist. I spent the next hour pacing the cabin, alternating between staring out the windows and trying to convince myself that there was a rational explanation for all of this. But deep down, I knew that I was facing something beyond the realm of normal experience. As the morning wore on and nothing further happened, I began to feel a bit foolish. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation for everything. Determined to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind, I decided to venture outside and investigate the tracks I'd seen. With cautious steps, I made my way around the cabin, my eyes fixed on the ground. The footprints were even more unsettling up close. They were deeply imprinted in the soft earth, suggesting a creature of immense weight. As I followed their path, I noticed broken twigs and disturbed vegetation, further evidence of something large moving through the area. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it as my voice echoed through the silent forest. "Is anyone out there?" Only the rustling of leaves in the gentle morning breeze answered me. I shook my head, feeling ridiculous. What was I expecting? For Bigfoot to step out from behind a tree and introduce himself? Deciding I needed a distraction from my unsettling thoughts, I resolved to go for a hike. Maybe some physical activity would help clear my head and put things in perspective. I grabbed a small backpack, stuffed it with some water and snacks, and set off down one of the trails Mike had mentioned. As I hiked, the beauty of the forest began to work its magic on my frayed nerves. The sunlight filtering through the canopy, the chirping of birds, the fresh mountain air. It all served to push the events of the night to the back of my mind. I began to feel foolish for having been so frightened. Surely there was a logical explanation for everything. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon a clearing that stopped me in my tracks. The scene before me defied belief. Trees that must have stood for decades lay snapped like twigs, their massive trunks splintered and torn. The destruction was far beyond the capability of any normal creature I knew of. "What the hell could have done this?" I whispered, my earlier calm evaporating in an instant. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a blood-curdling roar echoed through the valley. The sound froze me in place, every muscle in my body tensing. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but filled with a primal rage that sent shivers down my spine. The roar seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing off the mountains and reverberating through the trees. As it faded, an eerie silence fell over the forest. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if they too were holding their breath in fear. That's when I realized I was no longer alone in these woods. My survival instincts kicked in, and I turned to run back towards the cabin. As I hurried along the trail, my eyes darted frantically from side to side, searching for any sign of movement among the trees. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just moments ago now felt oppressive and threatening. I caught a glimpse of something massive moving through the trees to my left. Its dark silhouette was unnaturally tall and broad, moving with a speed that belied its size. I only saw it for a split second before it disappeared behind the thick foliage, but that was enough to send me into a full-blown panic. My pace quickened to a sprint, my lungs burning as I tore down the trail. Branches whipped at my face, but I barely felt them. So consumed was I by the need to get back to the relative safety of the cabin. The sound of my own ragged breathing and pounding footsteps filled my ears, drowning out any other noises from the forest around me. As I burst out of the tree line and into the clearing where the cabin stood, I risked a glance back. For a moment I thought I saw two glowing eyes peering at me from the shadows of the forest, but when I blinked, they were gone. Had I imagined it? I didn't stop to ponder. I raced up the porch steps, fumbled with the key, and practically fell through the door, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, sliding down to sit on the floor as I tried to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of my situation started to sink in. I was trapped in this remote cabin, miles from help, with something out there that defied explanation. Something that, judging by the destruction I'd seen in the clearing, was immensely powerful and potentially hostile. I knew I should leave, get in my truck and drive as fast as I could back to civilization. But the thought of venturing outside again, of potentially coming face to face with whatever was out there, paralyzed me with fear. As the afternoon sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, I realized with growing dread that I would have to spend another night here. I moved through the cabin, double-checking every lock, pulling curtains closed, and gathering anything I could use as a weapon. As darkness fell, I huddled in the center of the main room, a kitchen knife clutched in one hand, my flashlight in the other, straining my ears for any sound of approach. The night stretched on, each creaking floorboard and rustling leaf outside sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I didn't know what the creature out there wanted, or why it seemed to be fixated on this area, but I knew with chilling certainty that this was far from over. Whatever was stalking these woods, whatever had made those impossible footprints and destroyed those trees, it was still out there. And somehow, I knew it was coming for me. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. As soon as it was light enough, I would make a break for my truck and get the hell out of these mountains. Little did I know, the true horror of my encounter was yet to come. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the cabin windows, I steeled myself for what I knew I had to do. The night had been a torment of imagined sounds and shadows, every creak and rustle sending my heart racing. I hadn't slept a wink, my body tense and ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Now, with the relative safety of daylight, I began to gather my belongings, shoving them haphazardly into my duffel bag. My hands shook as I zipped it closed, my mind racing with plans of escape. Just get to the truck, I told myself. Get to the truck and drive. Don't look back. I approached the cabin door, my hand hesitating on the knob. Taking a deep breath, I slowly turned it and peered outside. The clearing seemed peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of the terror that had stalked the night. Birds chirped in the distance, a mockery of normalcy that did little to ease my frayed nerves. Cautiously, I stepped onto the porch, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so. I made my way down the steps, my duffel bag clutched tightly to my chest like a shield. I was halfway to my truck when I saw them, two glowing eyes peering at me through the cabin window, far too high to be any normal animal. My blood ran cold as I realized the creature hadn't been out in the forest at all. It had been inside the cabin watching me, waiting. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Those inhuman eyes held mine, filled with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. Then, with a crash that shattered the morning silence, the creature burst through the cabin wall as if it were made of paper. I stood frozen in terror as the beast revealed itself fully for the first time. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with a protruding brow and a mouth full of yellowed, sharp teeth. This was Bigfoot, the creature of legend, and it was real, and it was coming for me. The cabin walls shook as the monster slammed against them, wood splintering under its immense strength. I watched in horror as it tore through the structure I had thought was my refuge, reducing it to kindling in seconds. My paralysis broke and I scrambled for my truck, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled for my keys. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing behind me, getting closer with each passing second. I finally managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as a massive, hairy arm swiped at where I had been standing. The truck rocked as Bigfoot slammed into its side, the metal groaning under the impact. With trembling hands, I jammed the key into the ignition, praying the old engine would start. Come on, I muttered, turning the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, but wouldn't catch. A roar of frustration shook the very air around me, and I looked up to see the creature's face pressed against the driver's side window, its hot breath fogging the glass. Its eyes filled with primal rage bored into mine, and I knew in that moment that it wouldn't stop until it had torn me apart. In desperation, I reached for my phone, hoping against hope that I might have a signal. As I pulled it out, the screen lit up, showing a single bar of reception. My heart leapt. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911, my eyes never leaving the monster that was now pounding on the truck's roof, the metal buckling under its fists. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was like a lifeline in the chaos. Help me, I screamed into the phone. There's a creature attacking me. I'm at the Harris cabin off Route 7 in... My words were cut off as the truck's roof suddenly caved in, the creature's massive arm punching through the metal like it was tinfoil. I dropped the phone, hearing the operator's voice fade away as it clattered to the floor. I threw myself into the passenger seat, narrowly avoiding the grasping claws that raked through the space where I had been sitting. The door burst open with a deafening crack, and I found myself face to face with the stuff of nightmares. Bigfoot's foul breath washed over me as it roared, revealing rows of yellowed, razor-sharp teeth that could tear me apart in seconds. Its eyes, filled with an otherworldly intelligence and rage, locked onto mine. In that moment, I knew that this was no mindless beast. There was a cruel, calculating mind behind those eyes, one that saw me as nothing more than prey. With strength born of pure terror, I kicked out at the creature's face, my foot connecting solidly with its jaw. It reeled back, more in surprise than pain, giving me the opening I needed. I scrambled out of the passenger side door, hitting the ground hard and rolling to my feet. I ran blindly into the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature's roars of fury and the sound of trees being knocked aside as it gave chase. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on, driven by the primal need to survive. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that monster as possible. As I ran, my mind raced with questions. How could this be real? Bigfoot was supposed to be a myth, a campfire story to scare kids. But the creature pursuing me was all too real, its roars echoing through the forest, getting closer with each passing second. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The beast was gaining on me, its long strides eating up the distance between us with terrifying speed. Its eyes, filled with murderous intent, locked onto mine, and I knew that if it caught me, there would be no mercy. Turning back, I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my muscles and the stitch in my side. I had to find help, had to reach civilization. But as the sound of pursuit grew ever closer, a sinking feeling in my gut told me that I might not make it out of these woods alive. The forest ahead began to thin, and for a brief moment, hope surged within me. Maybe I was nearing a road, or a clearing where I might have a chance to outmaneuver my pursuer. But as I burst through the tree line, my heart sank. I found myself at the edge of a steep ravine, a sheer drop of at least 30 feet to the rocky stream below. The roar of the creature behind me grew louder, leaves and branches crackling under its massive feet. I was trapped, caught between an unstoppable force and an impassable obstacle. Time seemed to slow as I turned to face my pursuer. Bigfoot emerged from the forest, its massive form blocking out the sun. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw not just rage, but a cold, calculating intelligence that chilled me to my core. As the creature charged towards me, I made a split-second decision. With a silent prayer, I turned and leapt off the edge of the ravine, plummeting toward the stream below. The last thing I heard before hitting the water was the frustrated roar of the beast, echoing off the canyon walls. The impact knocked the wind out of me, the icy water a shock to my system. I was swept downstream, tumbling over rocks and struggling to keep my head above water. As I fought against the current, one thought kept repeating in my mind. I had survived the first encounter, but I knew with chilling certainty that this was far from over. The true test of survival was yet to come. The icy water of the stream had numbed my body, but it couldn't numb the terror that gripped my heart. I dragged myself onto the rocky shore, gasping for air and shivering uncontrollably. Every muscle ached and my clothes clung to me, heavy with water and fear. But I knew I couldn't rest. Not yet. Not with that thing still out there. I stumbled to my feet, my eyes darting wildly around the unfamiliar terrain. The ravine walls loomed on either side, a reminder of my desperate leap. Somewhere above, I knew, the creature was searching for me. The thought spurred me into motion, and I began to make my way along the stream, hoping to find a way back to the cabin or, better yet, to civilization. As I trudged through the underbrush, my mind raced. What was that thing? How could Bigfoot, a creature of myth and legend, be real? And why was it so intent on hunting me? These questions swirled in my head, but I had no answers. Only the crushing certainty that I was being hunted by something beyond my understanding. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the wilderness, I caught sight of a familiar structure through the trees. My heart leapt. It was the cabin. Somehow I had made my way back. But as I approached, my relief turned to horror. I watched in disbelief as Bigfoot tore apart my cabin, its massive hands ripping through furniture and walls like they were made of paper. The destruction was methodical, almost purposeful. It wasn't just mindless rage. The creature was searching for something, searching for me. Frozen in place, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene. The beast's raw power was terrifying to behold. It lifted the heavy oak dining table with one hand, flinging it across the room where it shattered against the wall. The creature's muscles rippled under its thick fur as it tore down shelves and ripped open cabinets. Suddenly, its head snapped up, and its eyes locked onto mine. In that moment, I felt like a mouse that had just been spotted by a hawk. The creature's eyes were filled with a primal rage that told me I was its next target. There was no humanity in that gaze, no mercy. Only the cold, hard intent of a predator that had found its prey. I barely had time to react as the beast charged towards me. Its speed was incredible, covering the distance between us in mere seconds. I dodged its swinging arm, feeling the wind rush past me as I scrambled towards the back door of the ruined cabin. "Help!" I screamed, knowing it was futile. There was no one around for miles. No one to hear my cries, no one to come to my rescue. I was alone with this monster. The sound of splintering wood filled my ears as Bigfoot pursued me, demolishing everything in its path with terrifying ease. I could feel its hot breath on my neck as I ran into the woods, my legs pumping faster than I thought possible, fueled by pure adrenaline and fear. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the underbrush, leaving stinging cuts across my cheeks and forehead. But I couldn't slow down. The thunderous footsteps of the monster were close behind, each impact shaking the ground beneath my feet. I risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The massive form of Bigfoot was gaining on me with inhuman speed. Its long arms reached out, clawed hands grasping at the air just inches from my back. I pushed myself harder, knowing that slowing down for even a second would mean certain death. My lungs burned as I ran, each breath a ragged gasp. The forest blurred around me, trees and shadows melding into a green and brown maze. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond the primal need to escape. "Please," I gasped, though I wasn't sure who or what I was pleading with. "Please, Let me survive this. As if in answer to my desperate prayer, I spotted a fallen tree ahead, its massive trunk creating a small hollow beneath it. Without thinking, I dove for the opening, squeezing myself into the tight space. I held my breath as the creature's footsteps approached. They slowed, and I could hear its heavy breathing, smell its musky animal odor. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. For what felt like an eternity, the beast prowled around my hiding spot. I could see its feet through gaps in the trunk, massive and claw-tipped, crushing the undergrowth with each step. Then, with a frustrated roar that shook leaves from the trees, it moved on, its footsteps fading into the distance. I remained frozen in my hiding place, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an hour. Finally, when I could no longer hear any sign of the creature, I cautiously emerged from my shelter. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds sang, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I knew I couldn't stay here. The beast would be back, and next time I might not be so lucky. With shaking legs, I began to make my way through the forest, trying to find some sign of which direction might lead me to safety. As I walked, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. I had come face to face with a creature that shouldn't exist, a monster straight out of campfire stories and blurry photographs, and it had nearly killed me. Tears began to stream down my face, a mix of fear, exhaustion, and the overwhelming realization of how close I had come to death. "Get it together, John," I muttered to myself, wiping my eyes with a grimy hand. "You're not out of this yet." Just then, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees closer than I had expected. The creature was back on my trail. Panic surged through me as I broke into a run once more. I had no strength left, my muscles screaming in protest, but fear drove me onward. The growls grew louder, punctuated by the crash of breaking branches as Bigfoot pursued me through the dense forest. I burst through a line of trees into a small clearing, my eyes frantically searching for somewhere, anywhere to hide. But it was too late. A massive shadow fell over me, and I turned to see the creature looming above me, its eyes gleaming with murderous intent. Time seemed to slow as I faced the monster. Its massive form blocked out the sun, casting me in its terrible shadow. I could see every detail of its face: the matted fur, the jutting brow, the yellowed teeth bared in a snarl. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But some spark of survival instinct flared within me. With a desperate cry, I lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's grasping hands. I felt the wind of its passage as its claws raked the air where I had been standing a moment before. I scrambled away, my feet slipping on the damp forest floor. The beast roared in frustration, the sound so loud it seemed to shake the very air around us. I knew I couldn't outrun it, couldn't overpower it. My only hope was to outsmart it somehow. As I ran, my eyes locked onto a dense thicket of thorny bushes ahead. Without hesitation, I dove into the brambles, ignoring the sharp thorns that tore at my skin and clothes. I burrowed deeper into the thicket, praying that the creature's bulk would prevent it from following. I heard Bigfoot's roar of rage as it reached the edge of the thicket. The bushes shook violently as it tried to reach in, its long arms thrashing through the thorny branches. I pressed myself flat against the ground, feeling thorns dig into my back. But I didn't dare move. For what felt like hours, the creature raged outside my thorny sanctuary. I could hear it circling, searching for a way to reach me. But eventually, its frustrated roars began to fade, moving further and further away until I could no longer hear them. I remained motionless, afraid to even breathe too loudly. My body ached, covered in cuts and bruises, and my mind reeled from the impossible events of the day. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived. As the light began to fade from the sky, I knew I couldn't stay in the thicket forever. I had to find help, had to get out of these cursed woods. With painstaking slowness, I began to extract myself from the brambles, wincing at every scratch and thorn. Emerging into the twilight forest, I looked around warily. There was no sign of the creature, but I knew it was still out there waiting. This respite was temporary at best. I had to keep moving, had to find my way back to civilization before the beast found me again. With a deep breath, I picked a direction and started walking. The forest loomed dark and menacing around me, every shadow potentially hiding my pursuer. But I pressed on, driven by the will to survive and the desperate hope that somehow I would make it through this nightmare alive. Little did I know, the true horror of my ordeal was far from over. The night was falling, and with it, the monster would return, more determined than ever to claim its prey. The forest had become a maze of shadows and menace as night fell. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through my battered body. I stumbled forward, driven by the primal need to escape, to survive. My clothes were torn and bloodied, my skin a canvas of cuts and bruises from my earlier encounters with the beast. I tried to orient myself, to find some familiar landmark that might guide me back to civilization. But the darkness made everything alien and threatening. The moon, when it occasionally peeked through the dense canopy, cast an eerie, silvery light that transformed the forest into a nightmarish landscape. As I pushed through a particularly dense thicket, the silence was suddenly shattered by a bone-chilling roar. It was close, too close. The beast had found my trail again. "No, no, no," I muttered, my voice hoarse and barely audible. Fear gave me a burst of energy, and I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face as I tore through the underbrush. The thunderous footsteps of the monster echoed behind me, growing louder with each passing second. I could hear trees cracking and splintering as it barreled through the forest, demolishing everything in its path in its relentless pursuit. I risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The massive form of Bigfoot was gaining on me with inhuman speed. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light in the darkness, fixed on me with predatory intensity. I could make out every terrifying detail. The matted fur, the enormous muscled arms, the bared teeth that gleamed in the moonlight. "Help!" I screamed, knowing it was futile. "Somebody, please help me!" But there was no one to hear my cries, no one to come to my rescue. I was alone in this nightmare with only my will to survive driving me forward. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, knowing that slowing down for even a second would mean certain death. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I barely felt the pain. So consumed was I by the need to escape. I burst into a small clearing, the sudden lack of obstacles causing me to stumble. As I regained my footing, I heard the creature's roar of triumph. It was so close now that I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. In desperation, I veered sharply to the left, diving back into the dense forest. The sudden change in direction seemed to momentarily confuse the beast, and I heard it crash into a tree behind me, its roar of frustration shaking the very ground. I used this brief advantage to push myself even harder, my legs pumping faster than I thought possible. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, dulling the pain and fatigue that threatened to overwhelm me. As I ran, the ground beneath my feet began to slope downward. The descent grew steeper, and I realized I was heading into a ravine. Part of me knew this could be dangerous, that I might be trapping myself, but I had no choice. I could hear the creature crashing through the forest behind me, gaining ground once more. The slope became treacherous, loose rocks and dirt sliding beneath my feet. I lost my balance, tumbling head over heels down the steep incline. The world spun around me as I rolled, my body slamming against rocks and roots. I came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, dazed and disoriented. Every part of me ached, and I tasted blood in my mouth. But the sound of the beast's approach spurred me back into action. I scrambled to my feet, looking around frantically for somewhere to hide. That's when I saw it. A small opening in the ravine wall, partially hidden by fallen rocks and vegetation. A cave. Without hesitation, I dove for the entrance, squeezing through the narrow opening. The cave was pitch black and smelled of damp earth and decay. I crawled deeper into the darkness, my hands scraping against rough stone. Behind me, I heard the creature's roar of frustration echo off the ravine walls. I pressed myself against the cold stone at the back of the cave, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure the beast would hear it. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound of approach. The cave entrance darkened as Bigfoot's massive form blocked out the moonlight. Its growls sent vibrations through the very rock around me. I could hear it sniffing the air, searching for my scent. The creature's long arms reached into the cave, searching for me. I pressed myself harder against the rock, feeling the rough surface scrape my back. The beast's claws came within inches of my face, so close I could see the dirt caked under its nails. Tears streamed down my face as I silently begged for dawn, knowing that the monster could easily drag me out to my doom at any moment. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in terror as the creature continued its efforts to reach me. Eventually, the beast's growls of frustration grew more distant. I heard the sound of its heavy footsteps moving away from the cave entrance, but I didn't dare move, didn't dare to even breathe too loudly. This could be a trick, a ploy to lure me out. Hours passed like years as I huddled in the damp cave, every sound making me flinch in terror. My body ached from the chase and fall, and exhaustion pulled at me, but I fought against sleep. I couldn't risk lowering my guard, not with that thing still out there. As the first light of day filtered into the cave, I realized with a mix of relief and dread that I had survived the night. But my ordeal was far from over. I was lost in the wilderness, injured, and being hunted by a creature that defied explanation. Cautiously, I crawled towards the cave entrance, my muscles protesting with every movement. I peered out into the ravine, searching for any sign of the beast. The forest was quiet. The only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. I emerged from the cave on shaky legs, wincing at the brightness of the morning sun. The destroyed forest around me was a testament to the creature's rampage. Trees lay splintered and broken. Deep gouges marred the earth where its claws had dug in during the chase. My heart sank as I surveyed the wreckage. Even if I managed to find my way back to civilization, who would believe my story? The destruction around me seemed impossible, more like the aftermath of a natural disaster than the work of a single creature. I sifted through the debris, desperately searching for anything I could use, a weapon, a tool, anything that might help me survive and find my way out of this nightmare. But there was nothing but broken branches and torn vegetation. A low growl from the tree line sent me sprinting down the ravine, my battered body protesting with every step. The beast was still out there, still hunting me, and I knew with chilling certainty that it wouldn't stop until it had caught me. As I ran, my mind raced with questions. How could I escape? How could I survive against a creature that seemed unstoppable? And even if I did make it out alive, would anyone believe what had happened to me? The sound of rushing water reached my ears, growing louder as I ran. Hope surged within me. A river might lead me to civilization, or at least provide a means of throwing the creature off my scent. I burst out of the tree line to find myself at the edge of a fast-moving river. The water looked deep and dangerous, white foam churning over hidden rocks. It was a risk, but one I had to take. Without hesitation, I plunged into the icy water. The current immediately swept me off my feet, pulling me downstream at a terrifying speed. I fought to keep my head above water, gasping for air between the waves that crashed over me. As I was carried away by the river, I caught a glimpse of a massive, dark form emerging from the forest at the spot where I had entered the water. The creature's roar of frustration was drowned out by the rush of the river, but I could see the rage in its eyes as it watched its prey being swept beyond its reach. The river carried me further and further from the beast, but I knew this was far from over. I had survived the night, escaped the immediate threat, but I was now lost, injured, and adrift in a wilderness that had proven to be far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. As I struggled to stay afloat, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This nightmare was far from over. The true test of survival was yet to come. The river's icy embrace had numbed my battered body, but it couldn't numb the terror that still gripped my heart. I don't know how long I was carried by the current, tumbling over rocks and through rapids before I finally managed to drag myself onto the shore. Exhausted and shivering, I collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping for air. As I lay there, the events of the past day crashed over me like waves. The destruction of the cabin, the terrifying chase through the forest, the nightmarish face of the creature that hunted me. It all seemed like a fever dream. But the pain in my body and the tattered state of my clothes were stark reminders that this was all too real. "Get up, John," I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse and barely audible. "You can't stay here." With monumental effort, I pushed myself to my feet. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Night was coming, and with it, the possibility that the creature, that Bigfoot, would find me again. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The river had carried me far from where I had entered it, and nothing looked familiar. Dense forest stretched in every direction, and in the fading light, every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. "Is anyone out there? I need help." Only the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird answered me. I was alone, lost in a wilderness that had proven far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. With no better option, I began to walk, following the river downstream. My waterlogged shoes squelched with each step, and my clothes clung to me, chilling me to the bone. But I couldn't stop. I had to find help, had to get out of these woods before the beast found me again. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Each noise made me flinch, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the monster that had been pursuing me. Hours passed like years as I trudged through the darkness. My body ached from the chase and the river's battering, and exhaustion pulled at me like a physical weight. But I fought against it, knowing that to stop, to rest, could mean death. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw something that made my heart leap, a flicker of light through the trees. Could it be? Had I finally found civilization? Hope gave me a burst of energy, and I quickened my pace, moving towards the light. As I got closer, I realized it was firelight, dancing and flickering. A campfire. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking with emotion. "Is someone there? I need help." I burst into a small clearing to find a campsite, a tent, a smoldering fire, and camping gear scattered around. But there was no one there. "Hello?" I called again, looking around frantically. "Please, if anyone's here, I need help." That's when I saw it. A trail of destruction leading away from the campsite. Broken branches, trampled undergrowth, and worst of all, dark stains that looked horribly like blood. My blood ran cold as I realized what must have happened. The creature had been here. The campers, whoever they were, had met the same fate I had been running from. A low, rumbling growl from the tree line confirmed my worst fears. The beast had returned to its kill site, and now it had found new prey, me. I scrambled backwards, my eyes locked on the spot where I had heard the growl. The firelight cast dancing shadows through the trees, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, a massive dark shape shifting in the darkness. Without thinking, I dove into the tent, zipping it closed behind me. It was a flimsy barrier, I knew, but in my panic it was the only shelter available. I huddled in the corner of the tent, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the creature could hear it. Outside, I could hear heavy footsteps circling the campsite. The growls grew louder, closer. The tent entrance darkened as Bigfoot's massive form blocked out the firelight. Its growls sent vibrations through the very ground beneath me. I held my breath, pressing myself against the back of the tent as the creature's long arms reached for the zipper. In that moment, I was sure I was going to die. I closed my eyes, memories of my life flashing before me. I thought of my family, my friends, all the things I'd never get to do or say. But then, miraculously, the zipper stopped. The creature's growls turned to snorts, like it was smelling the air. After what felt like an eternity, I heard its heavy footsteps moving away from the tent. I didn't dare move, didn't dare to even breathe too loudly. This could be a trick, a ploy to lure me out. So I sat there, frozen in terror, as the night wore on. Every sound made me flinch. The crackle of the dying fire, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional snap of a twig in the forest. Each noise could be the creature returning, ready to finish what it had started. Tears streamed down my face as I silently begged for dawn, knowing that the monster could easily tear through the thin fabric of the tent and drag me out to my doom at any moment. As the first light of day filtered through the tent walls, I realized with a mix of relief and dread that I had survived the night. But my ordeal was far from over. I was still lost in the wilderness, injured, and being hunted by a creature that defied explanation. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent, peering out into the campsite. The fire had long since died, leaving only cold ashes. The morning light revealed more details of the destruction I had glimpsed the night before. Shredded sleeping bags, crushed cooking equipment, and those dark stains that I now knew for certain were blood. I emerged from the tent on shaky legs, wincing at the brightness of the morning sun. The destroyed campsite around me was a testament to the creature's power and ferocity. Even if I managed to find my way back to civilization, who would believe my story? As I sifted through the debris, desperately searching for anything I could use to aid my survival, a glint of metal caught my eye. Half buried in the dirt was a smartphone, its screen cracked but still intact. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone. To my amazement, it powered on. No signal, of course. I was too deep in the wilderness for that. But it had GPS. If I could just find higher ground, maybe I could get a signal, call for help. A twig snapped in the forest behind me, and I whirled around, my heart racing. Was it back? Had the creature returned? I didn't wait to find out. Clutching the phone like a lifeline, I took off running, heading for a ridge I could see in the distance. If I could just reach higher ground, maybe I could get a signal. Maybe I could finally escape this nightmare. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That somewhere in the forest behind me, a pair of inhuman eyes were tracking my every move. The long night was over, but I knew the true test of survival was yet to come. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as I stumbled through the forest, clutching the battered smartphone like a lifeline. My legs felt like lead, every step a monumental effort after the horrors of the night before. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to find help before the creature found me again. As I emerged from the tree line onto a small hill, I raised the phone skyward, desperately hoping for a signal. One bar flickered to life, then two. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911, my heart pounding in my chest. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was like music to my ears. Please, I need help, I gasped, my voice hoarse and barely recognizable. I'm lost in the woods. There's something out here, something not human. It's been chasing me. Please, you have to send someone. Sir, try to calm down, the operator said. Can you tell me your location? I glanced at the GPS on the phone. I'm about 20 miles northeast of Silverton, in the San Juan National Forest. Please, you have to hurry. It killed the people at the campsite. It's still out here. Sir, what do you mean, it? Is there a dangerous animal in the area? I hesitated. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? It's Bigfoot, I finally said, the words sounding insane even to my own ears. I know how that sounds, but I swear it's true. It destroyed my cabin. It's been hunting me. Please, you have to believe me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When the operator spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. Sir, we're dispatching search and rescue to your location. Please stay where you are and try to remain calm. Help is on the way. The call ended, and I slumped to the ground, relief and exhaustion washing over me in equal measure. Help was coming. I just had to hold on a little longer. As I sat there, waiting and watching the forest around me, my mind wandered back to the destroyed campsite. The blood, the scattered belongings, the evidence of lives brutally cut short. Guilt gnawed at me. If I hadn't led the creature there, would those people still be alive? A rustling in the underbrush snapped me back to the present. My heart rate spiked as I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Was it back? Had it followed me here? I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound of approach. For a moment, all was silent. Then, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees, sending chills down my spine. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet. I had to move, had to find somewhere to hide. But where? The hilltop was exposed, offering no shelter. As I turned to run, my foot caught on a root, sending me tumbling down the slope. I rolled head over heels, branches and rocks battering my already battered body. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom of the hill, every inch of me ached. I lay there, dazed and winded, staring up at the canopy above. That's when I saw it. A massive dark shape moving through the trees at the top of the hill. Its movements were unnaturally fluid for something so large, weaving between the trunks with ease. I held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The creature paused, its head turning as if scanning the area. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it had spotted me. But then it moved on, disappearing into the dense forest. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to my feet. My clothes were torn and muddy, fresh cuts and bruises adding to my collection of injuries. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived another encounter. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The fall had disoriented me, and I wasn't sure which direction I had come from. The dense forest looked the same in every direction. "Hello?" I called out weakly, hoping against hope that the search and rescue team had somehow arrived. "Is anyone there?" Only the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves answered me. I was still alone. With no better option, I picked a direction and started walking. Each step was agony, my body protesting after the abuse it had endured. But I pushed on, driven by the desperate need to escape this nightmare. As I walked, I tried to make sense of what had happened. How could Bigfoot be real? And if it was, why had it fixated on me? The questions swirled in my mind, but I had no answers. Hours passed as I trudged through the wilderness. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat oppressive. Thirst clawed at my throat and hunger gnawed at my stomach. But I didn't dare stop to look for water or food. Not with that thing still out there. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard something that made my heart leap. The distant thrum of helicopter blades. "Here!" I screamed, waving my arms frantically. "I'm down here!" The sound grew louder, and suddenly, a helicopter burst into view above the treetops. Relief flooded through me as I saw the search and rescue markings on its side. As the helicopter circled overhead, I saw a clearing not far away. With renewed energy, I stumbled towards it, waving and shouting the whole way. The helicopter touched down in the clearing, its rotors whipping up a whirlwind of leaves and debris. 2 rescue workers jumped out, rushing towards me. "Are you John Harris?" one of them shouted over the noise of the engine. I nodded, tears of relief streaming down my face. "Yes, that's me. Thank God you're here." They led me to the helicopter, helping me climb inside. As we lifted off, I looked down at the forest below. Somewhere down there, hidden in the green expanse, was a creature that shouldn't exist. A monster that had nearly killed me. As the forest receded beneath us, I felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. I had escaped, but at what cost? And would anyone believe what had happened to me? One of the rescue workers was asking me questions, probably assessing my physical and mental state. But I barely heard him. My mind was still in that forest, reliving the terror of the past 2 days. As we flew toward civilization and safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that this ordeal was far from over. The creature was still out there, and I was the only one who knew the truth. The real challenge, I realized, was yet to come. How could I make anyone believe what I had experienced, And what if the creature decided it wasn't done with me yet? With these unsettling thoughts swirling in my mind, I closed my eyes, finally allowing exhaustion to overtake me as the helicopter carried me away from the forest that had nearly become my tomb. The steady beep of medical equipment pulled me from a fitful sleep. For a moment I panicked, not recognizing my surroundings. Then reality set in. I was in a hospital, safe from the nightmare that had pursued me through the forest. A nurse entered the room, her smile friendly but tinged with concern. "Mr. Harris? How are you feeling?" I tried to sit up, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. "I've been better," I croaked, my throat dry and raw. She helped me sip some water, then said, "The doctor will be in shortly, and there are some police officers who'd like to speak with you if you're up for it." I nodded, steeling myself for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? The doctor arrived first, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a reassuring manner. He checked my vitals and examined my numerous cuts and bruises. "You're lucky, Mr. Harris," he said. "No major injuries, just a lot of cuts, bruises, and mild dehydration. You should be able to go home in a day or two." I almost laughed. Lucky? If he only knew. After the doctor left, 2 police officers entered the room. They introduced themselves as Officer Martinez and Detective Johnson. "Mr. Harris," Detective Johnson began, his tone professional but skeptical. "We'd like to hear your account of what happened in the forest." I took a deep breath and began my story. I told them about the cabin, the first signs of something strange in the woods. I described the creature, its massive size, its inhuman strength, the terror of being hunted through the forest. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief growing in their eyes. Officer Martinez was taking notes, but her pen slowed and eventually stopped as my tale became more fantastic. When I finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, Detective Johnson cleared his throat. "Mr. Harris," he said carefully, "that's quite a story. But I have to ask, is it possible that the stress of being lost in the woods combined with exhaustion and dehydration might have caused you to misinterpret what you saw?" I felt a surge of frustration. "I know how it sounds," I said, my voice rising. "But I'm telling you, it was real. Bigfoot is real, and it's out there. It destroyed my cabin. It killed those campers. You have to believe me." Officer Martinez stepped in, her voice gentle. "We checked out the coordinates of the cabin you gave us, Mr. Harris. There was some damage, yes, but nothing like what you described, and we found no evidence of any large creature." My heart sank. "But that's impossible. I saw it tear the cabin apart with its bare hands." Detective Johnson sighed. "We did find some unusual tracks around the cabin site, but our wildlife expert says they were likely from a large bear. As for the campsite you mentioned, we found it, but there was no sign of any attack. The owners reported that they had to leave suddenly due to a family emergency." I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "No, that's not. I saw the blood, the destruction. It was there." The officers exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. They didn't believe me. No one was going to believe me. "Get some rest, Mr. Harris," Detective Johnson said, standing up. "We may have some more questions for you later." After they left, I lay back in the hospital bed, my mind reeling. How could there be no evidence? I had seen it, felt its hot breath on my face, heard its roars echo through the forest. It was real. I knew it was real. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. A man in a suit entered, introducing himself as Dr. Erickson, a psychologist. "How are you feeling, Mr. Harris?" he asked, taking a seat beside my bed. I eyed him warily. "You're here to tell me I'm crazy, aren't you?" He smiled gently. "I'm here to help you process what you've been through. You've had a traumatic experience, and it's natural for the mind to try to make sense of it, sometimes in unusual ways." "You don't believe me either," I said flatly. "I believe that you believe what you saw was real," he replied carefully. "But sometimes, Under extreme stress, our minds can play tricks on us. It's a coping mechanism. I turned away, staring out the window at the mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there I knew the creature was still roaming free. But how could I prove it? Mr. Harris, Dr. Erickson continued, I'd like to schedule some sessions with you once you're discharged. I think it could help you work through this experience. I nodded numbly, not really listening. My mind was back in the forest, reliving every terrifying moment of my encounter. The destruction of the cabin, the chase through the woods, the long night in the cave. It had all been real. Hadn't it? As the day wore on, more people came to question me. Forest rangers, wildlife experts, even a local reporter who had somehow heard about my Bigfoot encounter. Each conversation left me feeling more frustrated and doubted. By evening, I was emotionally exhausted. I lay in the darkened hospital room, the events of the past 2 days playing on repeat in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's face, felt the terror of being hunted. A nurse came in to check on me, frowning at my elevated heart rate. Try to get some sleep, Mr. Harris, she said kindly. You're safe now. But that was the problem, wasn't it? I didn't feel safe. How could I, knowing what was out there? And how could I rest when no one believed me? As I lay there in the quiet hospital room, I made a decision. If no one would believe me, I would have to find proof myself. Somehow, someway, I would show the world that Bigfoot was real. But even as I made this resolution, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered doubts. What if they were right? What if it had all been a stress-induced hallucination? The lack of evidence, the contradictions in what I thought I had seen. Could I trust my own memories? I pushed these thoughts aside. I knew what I had experienced. It had been real, all of it, and I would prove it no matter what it took. As I finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that my ordeal was far from over. The creature might be gone for now, but its shadow still loomed over me, and I knew that until I could prove its existence, I would never truly be free of the terror I had experienced in those woods. The harsh fluorescent lights of my apartment felt alien after the days spent in the dim forest and sterile hospital room. I stood in the middle of my living room, bag still in hand, feeling oddly out of place in my own home. The clock on the wall showed it was just past noon, but time had lost all meaning to me since my ordeal began. I dropped my bag and made my way to the bathroom, catching sight of my reflection in the mirror. The face that stared back at me was almost unrecognizable, gaunt, with dark circles under haunted eyes. Cuts and bruises marred my skin, each one a stark reminder of what I'd been through. As I showered, watching dirt and dried blood swirl down the drain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was washing away evidence that no one believed existed in the first place. The hot water soothed my aching muscles, but did nothing to calm the storm in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that creature, its massive form, its inhuman strength, the primal rage in its eyes. A sudden bang from the apartment next door made me jump, my heart racing. For a split second, I was back in the forest, the sound of Bigfoot tearing through trees echoing in my ears. Get a grip, John, I muttered to myself, leaning against the shower wall. You're safe now. It's over. But was it really over? The creature was still out there somewhere in those mountains, and no one believed me. After dressing in clean clothes, I made my way to the kitchen, realizing I hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. As I rummaged through the fridge, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from my friend Mike, the one who had told me about the cabin. Hey man, heard what happened? You okay? Want to grab a beer and talk about it? I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. How could I explain what had happened? Would Mike believe me when no one else had? Before I could reply, there was a knock at my door. I tensed, irrationally expecting to see a massive, fur-covered hand smash through the wood. Instead, I heard a familiar voice. John, it's Sarah. Can I come in? I opened the door to find my sister standing there, concern etched on her face. Without a word, she pulled me into a tight hug. "God, John, I was so worried," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "When the hospital called, I thought—" "I'm okay, Sarah," I said, surprised by how hollow my voice sounded. "Really?" She pulled back, studying my face. "You don't look okay. What happened out there, John? They said something about you getting lost, hallucinating." I felt a flash of anger. "I didn't hallucinate anything. It was real, Sarah. All of it." Sarah's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. "John, you're not making sense. Come on, let's sit down. You need to eat something." As she bustled around my kitchen, heating up soup and making sandwiches, I sat at the table, feeling numb. I wanted to tell her everything, to make her understand the terror I'd experienced, but the words wouldn't come. "Here," she said, placing a steaming bowl in front of me. "Eat. Then we can talk." I ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. Sarah watched me, her brow furrowed with worry. "John," she said softly, "what really happened out there?" I put down my spoon, meeting her gaze. "You won't believe me. No one does." "Try me," she said, reaching out to squeeze my hand. So I told her. Everything. The strange noises at the cabin, the first terrifying glimpse of the creature, the desperate chase through the forest. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief growing in her eyes, mixed with something else. Pity. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice gentle. "John, I don't know what to say. You've been through a traumatic experience and—" "Don't," I cut her off, pulling my hand away. "Don't tell me it wasn't real. I know what I saw, Sarah. It was there." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Okay. I'm not saying I don't believe you, I'm just worried about you. Maybe you should talk to someone, a professional who can help you process what happened." I laughed bitterly. "You mean a shrink? So they can tell me I'm crazy too?" "That's not what I meant," Sarah said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I just want to help you, John. We all do." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't need help. I need someone to believe me." Sarah rose too, reaching out to me. "John, please." But I was already moving away, heading for my bedroom. "I'm tired, Sarah. I think you should go." I closed the door behind me, cutting off her protests. Alone in the dim room, I sank onto my bed, my head in my hands. How had everything gone so wrong? How had I gone from a relaxing weekend getaway to this? As the afternoon wore on, I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling. My phone buzzed periodically, messages from friends and coworkers who had heard about my ordeal. Each one expressed concern, asked if I was okay. None of them knew the truth. None of them would believe it if I told them. Evening fell, and with it came the shadows. Every shifting patch of darkness in my room seemed to hide a potential threat. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every creak and groan of the building. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares. In my dreams, I was back in the forest, running from a creature I couldn't see but could feel breathing down my neck. I woke several times, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. As dawn broke, I gave up on sleep and made my way to my computer. With shaking hands, I typed Bigfoot sightings into the search bar. Thousands of results popped up. Blurry photos, shaky video footage, eyewitness accounts. I devoured them all, searching for something, anything that matched what I had seen. Hours passed as I fell down the rabbit hole of cryptozoology websites and conspiracy theory forums. Some of the stories resonated with my experience, but many seemed far-fetched, even to me. Still, I couldn't stop searching. I had to find proof, had to show the world that I wasn't crazy. A knock at my door startled me out of my research frenzy. I opened it to find Mike standing there, a six-pack of beer in hand. "Hey, man," he said, his usual jovial tone subdued. Thought you might need this. I let him in, grateful for the company despite my earlier hesitation. We sat on my couch, beers in hand, an uncomfortable silence stretching between us. "So," Mike finally said, "want to talk about what happened?" I took a long swig of my beer, considering my words carefully. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Mike leaned forward, his expression serious. "Try me, John. We've been friends for years. Whatever happened out there, I want to understand." I looked at him, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, he would be the one to believe me. Taking a deep breath, I began my story once again, hoping against hope that this time, someone would listen. As I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The creature was still out there, and I was the only one who knew the truth. Somehow, I had to find a way to prove it. But as I looked at Mike's increasingly skeptical expression, I realized that the road ahead would be long and lonely. The true test wasn't surviving the forest. It was convincing the world that the monster in the woods was real. Weeks had passed since my encounter in the forest, but the memory of it clung to me like a second skin. I'd returned to work, trying to slip back into the routine of normal life, but nothing felt the same. Every shadow held the potential for danger. Every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. It was a crisp autumn morning when I found myself standing at the edge of a park near my apartment, staring into the tree line. The leaves had begun to turn, painting the forest in hues of red and gold. It should have been beautiful, but all I could see was a place where monsters could hide. "You okay, man?" a jogger asked as he passed, giving me a concerned look. I realized I'd been standing there, unmoving, for who knows how long. "Yeah," I muttered. "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. Not really. The nightmares hadn't stopped, vivid recreations of my terrifying chase through the woods. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of inhuman roars ringing in my ears. I turned away from the park and headed back to my apartment. As I walked, my phone buzzed with a news alert. My blood ran cold as I read the headline, "Mysterious Animal Attacks in Colorado Wilderness." With shaking hands, I opened the article. It described a series of unexplained incidents in the San Juan National Forest, hikers reporting strange noises, campsites found destroyed, and most chillingly, large, unidentified footprints discovered in remote areas. My heart pounded as I read. This was it, proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd experienced was real. But as I scrolled through the comments, my hope turned to frustration. People were dismissing the story, attributing the incidents to bears or vandals. "They don't understand," I muttered, pocketing my phone. "They haven't seen what I've seen." Back in my apartment, I paced restlessly, the walls feeling more like a cage than a refuge. The article had stirred up all the memories I'd been trying to suppress. I could almost smell the damp earth of the forest, feel the raw terror of being hunted. A knock at the door made me jump. I opened it to find Sarah standing there, a worried expression on her face. "John," she said, "we need to talk." I let her in, knowing what was coming. She'd been pushing me to see a therapist for weeks, convinced that I was suffering from some sort of PTSD. "I'm fine, Sarah," I said preemptively, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. She sighed, sitting down on my couch. "No, you're not. You're jumpy, you're not sleeping, you barely leave your apartment except for work. This isn't healthy, John." I wanted to argue, to tell her about the article, to make her understand that the threat was real. But I knew she wouldn't believe me. No one did. "I know you're worried," I said instead, "but I'm dealing with it in my own way." Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and frustration. "By obsessing over Bigfoot sightings on the internet? By convincing yourself that what happened was real?" "It was real," I snapped, my temper flaring. "I know what I saw, Sarah. I know what I experienced." She stood up, reaching out to me. "John, please, just talk to someone, a professional who can help you process what happened." I pulled away from her touch. I don't need to process anything. I need people to believe me. Sarah's expression hardened. Fine. If you won't get help, I don't know what else to do. But I can't keep watching you destroy yourself like this. She left, the door closing behind her with a finality that made my chest ache. I knew she meant well, but how could I make her understand? How could I make anyone understand? As evening fell, I found myself drawn to the window, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, beyond the glow of civilization, was the wilderness where I'd faced true terror. The creature was still out there. I was sure of it. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even here in my apartment on the 10th floor. Every creak of the building, every shadow in the corner of my eye, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with nightmares. I dreamed of running through an endless forest, the sound of heavy footsteps and inhuman breathing always just behind me. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the echo of a roar still ringing in my ears. Dawn found me at my computer scrolling through forums and websites dedicated to Bigfoot sightings. I'd become obsessed with finding corroborating evidence, something to validate my experience. But the more I read, the more I doubted myself. So many of these stories seemed far-fetched, even to me. Was I really one of these people now? A notification popped up on my screen, a reminder for a doctor's appointment. I'd been putting it off, but the persistent pain in my ribs from my ordeal in the forest finally forced me to seek medical attention. At the clinic, I sat nervously in the examination room, my eyes constantly darting to the door. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, reviewed my chart with a frown. "Mr. Harris," she said, "your x-rays show some healing fractures consistent with your reported fall. But I'm more concerned about your mental state. Have you been experiencing any anxiety or sleep disturbances?" I hesitated, torn between the need to talk to someone and the fear of being dismissed again. I've been having nightmares," I admitted, "and I can't shake the feeling that I'm in danger." The doctor nodded sympathetically. "That's not uncommon after a traumatic experience. Have you considered talking to a therapist?" I shook my head, frustration bubbling up. "You don't understand. It wasn't just getting lost in the woods. There was something out there, something—" I trailed off, seeing the familiar look of skepticism in her eyes. She patted my arm gently. "Mr. Harris, I think it would really help you to talk to someone about what you experienced. I can refer you to an excellent trauma specialist." I left the clinic with a prescription for sleeping pills and a referral I knew I wouldn't use. As I walked home, the weight of my isolation pressed down on me. No one believed me. No one understood the terror that still gripped me. Passing by the park again, I paused at the edge of the tree line. The forest seemed to call to me, both terrifying and somehow alluring. I stood there, torn between the need to prove myself right and the paralyzing fear of what I might find. As I turned to leave, a distant sound caught my attention. It was faint, barely audible over the city noise, but unmistakable to my ears. A low, rumbling roar echoing from the distant mountains. My heart raced as I spun around, scanning the tree line. There was nothing there, of course, just trees and shadows. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that my nightmare was far from over. The creature was still out there, waiting, and I was the only one who knew the truth. As I hurried home, my mind raced with questions. How could I prove what I'd seen? How could I make people believe me? And most terrifyingly, what if the creature decided it wasn't done with me yet? I knew one thing for certain. I would carry the truth of that horrifying encounter with me forever, believed by no one but myself. The lingering fear would always be there, a constant reminder of the monster that lurked in the shadows of the world, just beyond the edge of civilization. I never thought a simple day hike could change my life forever. My name is Rachel Turner, and I'm an avid hiker and nature enthusiast. Living in Northern California, I've always been drawn to the majestic Redwood National Park. That fateful day in early autumn, I decided to explore a new trail I'd heard about from fellow hikers. The morning was crisp and clear as I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. A light mist hung in the air, giving the forest an ethereal quality. I shouldered my backpack, double-checking that I had enough water, snacks, and my first aid kit. Little did I know how desperately I'd need it later. As I approached the trailhead, a park ranger was posting a new sign. "Morning," I called out cheerfully. "Anything I should know about before heading in?" The ranger, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, turned to me with a slight frown. "Just the usual precautions, ma'am. Stay on the marked trails, be aware of your surroundings, and make sure someone knows your planned route and return time." I nodded, having heard this advice countless times before. "Of course. I've let my roommate know my plans. Is there anything else?" He hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Nah, just keep your wits about you. We've had some strange reports lately. Probably just folks getting spooked by the usual wildlife, but you can't be too careful." His words sent a small shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. I'd encountered my fair share of wildlife before, and I was confident in my abilities to handle myself in the wilderness. "Will do, thanks," I replied, giving him a wave as I set off down the trail. The first hour of my hike was uneventful, filled with the peaceful sounds of the forest and the awe-inspiring sight of ancient redwoods towering above me. The trail wound its way deeper into the park, and I found myself completely alone, surrounded by nature's grandeur. It was around midday when I first noticed something off. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant among the massive trees. No response came, not even an echo. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as I continued down the trail, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every few steps, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something. But there was nothing there. Just the endless sea of redwood trunks stretching into the distance. The silence was broken by a sudden snap of a twig somewhere off to my left. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Is someone there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence again. Then a low guttural sound that sent ice through my veins. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. Fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I found myself backing away slowly, eyes darting around for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, a flash of dark, matted fur between two distant trees. My breath caught in my throat. "No," I whispered to myself. "It can't be." But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, a massive figure emerged from behind a redwood not 20 feet away. It was tall, impossibly tall, covered in thick, dark hair, and its eyes were fixed on me with an intelligence and malevolence that defied description. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We stared at each other. Then, with a roar that shook me to my core, it charged. I turned and ran, blind panic driving me forward. The sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls behind me spurred me on, adrenaline coursing through my veins. But I knew I couldn't outrun it. Whatever this thing was, it was faster, stronger, and knew the terrain far better than I did. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The creature was gaining on me, its massive arms swinging as it loped along with terrifying speed. In that split second of distraction, my foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I struggled to get back to my feet. But before I could, a huge hairy hand grabbed my ankle, dragging me backward. I screamed, my fingers clawing at the earth, desperately trying to find purchase. The creature flipped me over, and I found myself face to face with what I could only describe as Bigfoot. Its breath was hot and foul, its eyes filled with a primal rage that chilled me to the bone. I lashed out, kicking and punching with all my might, but it was like hitting a brick wall. With a growl that I felt more than heard, it picked me up as if I weighed nothing. I felt my ribs crack under the pressure of its grip, and a cry of pain escaped my lips. Then, with a violent thrust, it hurled me against the nearest tree. The world exploded into a kaleidoscope of pain and disorientation. I crumpled to the ground, my vision blurring. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was the massive figure of Bigfoot looming over me, its silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun filtering through the redwood canopy. As consciousness slipped away, one thought echoed through my mind. This can't be real. This can't be happening. But the pain, the terror, and the lingering scent of the creature told me otherwise. This was real, and my life would never be the same. I don't know how long I was out. When I finally came to, the forest was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Every inch of my body ached, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. Gingerly, I tried to sit up, gasping as pain shot through my ribs. "Hello?" I called out weakly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone there?" Only the faint rustle of leaves answered me. The creature, Bigfoot, was gone, leaving no trace of its presence save for the broken underbrush and my own battered body. With trembling hands, I reached for my backpack, which had somehow stayed on during the attack. My phone was there, but of course there was no signal this deep in the forest. I pulled out my first aid kit, doing my best to clean and bandage the worst of my cuts and scrapes. As the initial shock began to wear off, the full weight of what had happened started to sink in. I had been attacked by Bigfoot, a creature that wasn't supposed to exist. Who would believe me? How could I explain this? Tears of pain and frustration welled up in my eyes, but I forced them back. I couldn't afford to break down now. I had to get out of here, had to find help. Using a fallen branch as a makeshift crutch, I slowly and painfully made my way back towards the trail. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. The forest that I had always loved now felt alien and hostile. As the light began to fade, panic started to set in. What if I couldn't find my way out before dark? What if the creature came back? Just when I was about to give in to despair, I heard a faint sound in the distance. Voices. Human voices. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and desperate. "Please, somebody help me!" The voices grew closer, and soon I saw flashlight beams cutting through the growing darkness. It was the park ranger from earlier, along with a search party. "Over here!" the ranger called out as they spotted me. "Ma'am, are you all right? What happened?" As they reached me, I collapsed into their arms, the last of my strength giving out. Through sobs and gasps of pain, I tried to explain what had happened, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes, even as they worked to stabilize me. "It's okay. You're safe now," the ranger said soothingly, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "We'll get you to a hospital and you can tell us everything there." As they carried me out of the forest on a stretcher, I caught one last glimpse of the deep, dark woods behind us. For a moment, I thought I saw a large, shadowy figure watching from between the trees. But then I blinked, and it was gone. I closed my eyes, exhaustion overtaking me. I knew that even though I had escaped the forest, my ordeal was far from over. The real challenge would be convincing others of what I had experienced, a battle I wasn't sure I was prepared to fight. The world around me exploded into chaos as the massive, hair-covered creature lunged at me with inhuman speed. One moment I was frozen in terror, staring at what I could only describe as Bigfoot emerging from behind a redwood. The next, I was fighting for my life against a monster I'd always believed was just a myth. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat as the creature's enormous hands gripped my shoulders. Its strength was beyond anything I'd ever experienced or imagined. My feet left the ground as it effortlessly lifted me, and I found myself face to face with a visage straight out of a nightmare. The creature's eyes, dark and filled with a primal rage, bore into mine. Its face was a grotesque mix of ape and human features, covered in coarse, matted fur. The stench of its breath washed over me, a foul mixture of rotting meat and damp earth that made my stomach churn. "Let go of me," I screamed, my voice shrill with panic. I kicked and thrashed, but it was like fighting against a mountain. My blows seemed to have no effect on the creature at all. In response to my struggles, Bigfoot let out a bone-chilling roar that reverberated through the forest. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite animal, not quite human, but filled with unmistakable fury. Birds erupted from nearby trees, their panicked flight adding to the cacophony of terror surrounding me. I felt my ribs crack under the pressure of its enormous hands, and a cry of pain escaped my lips. The creature's grip tightened further, and for a moment, I was certain it was going to crush me to death right there. "Please," I gasped, tears streaming down my face. "Please don't kill me." But there was no hint of understanding or mercy in those dark, angry eyes. This wasn't a misunderstood gentle giant or a curious forest dweller. This was a predator, and I was its prey. With a violent thrust, it hurled me against a nearby tree. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I felt a sharp pain in my back as I collided with the rough bark. I crumpled to the ground, my vision blurring from the force of the blow. Dazed and in agony, I tried to push myself up, to crawl away, to do anything to escape. But my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch in horror as Bigfoot approached, its massive form blocking out the sunlight filtering through the canopy. "No," I whimpered, trying to shield my face with my arms. "No, please, no." The creature reached down, its huge hand wrapping around my ankle. I felt myself being dragged across the forest floor, leaves and twigs scraping against my skin. In desperation, I clawed at the ground, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. My fingers found a sturdy root, and I gripped it with all the strength I had left. "Help!" I screamed, knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself. "Somebody help me!" The forest remained silent, save for the grunts and growls of the creature as it tried to pull me away. For a moment, we were locked in a terrible tug-of-war, with my ankle as the rope. I could feel tendons and muscles straining, threatening to tear. Then, with a sickening pop, I felt my ankle give way. A fresh wave of pain washed over me, and I lost my grip on the root. The creature dragged me further into the underbrush, away from the trail, away from any hope of rescue. I don't know how long this went on. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of such terror. At some point, I must have hit my head on a rock or a fallen log, because suddenly the world started to spin and darken around the edges. As consciousness began to slip away, I had one last terrifying thought. This is how I die, alone in the woods, at the hands of a creature that shouldn't exist. But then, inexplicably, the dragging stopped. Through my fading vision, I saw the creature's head snap up as if listening to something I couldn't hear. For a long moment it stood perfectly still, its massive chest heaving with each breath. Then, without warning, it released my ankle and turned away. With shocking speed for something so large, it loped off into the forest, disappearing among the redwoods as quickly as it had appeared. I lay there, battered and broken, struggling to understand what had just happened. Had something scared it off? Or had it simply lost interest in me? The questions swirled in my mind, but I was in too much pain to focus on them. Slowly, painfully, I tried to take stock of my injuries. Everything hurt. My ribs screamed in agony with each breath. My ankle was swollen and throbbing. Cuts and bruises covered my body, and I could feel blood trickling from a gash on my forehead. "Hello?" I called out weakly, my voice hoarse from screaming. "Is anyone there?" Only the faint rustle of leaves answered me. I was alone, injured, and lost in a forest that suddenly seemed far more dangerous and alien than I'd ever imagined. With trembling hands, I reached for my backpack, which had somehow stayed on during the attack. My phone was there, but as I'd feared, there was no signal this deep in the woods. I pulled out my first aid kit, doing my best to clean and bandage the worst of my wounds. As I worked, the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. I had been attacked by Bigfoot, a creature that wasn't supposed to exist. Who would believe me? How could I explain this? Tears of pain and frustration welled up in my eyes, but I forced them back. I couldn't afford to break down now. I had to get out of here, had to find help. Using a fallen branch as a makeshift crutch, I slowly and painfully made my way back towards where I thought the trail might be. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. The forest that I had always loved now felt hostile and terrifying. As I limped along, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Was the creature still out there, following me, waiting for another opportunity to attack? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me, and I quickened my pace as much as my injuries would allow. The light was starting to fade, the forest growing darker by the minute. I knew I had to find my way out soon, or risk being trapped here overnight. The thought of spending the night in these woods with that thing out there was almost too much to bear. Just when I was about to give in to despair, I heard a faint sound in the distance. Voices. Human voices. "Help!" I screamed, my voice cracking with the effort. "Please, somebody help me." The voices grew closer, and soon I saw flashlight beams cutting through the growing darkness. It was the park ranger from earlier, along with a search party. "Over here," the ranger called out as they spotted me. "Ma'am, are you all right? What happened?" As they reached me, I collapsed into their arms, the last of my strength giving out. Through sobs and gasps of pain, I tried to explain what had happened, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes even as they worked to stabilize me. "It's okay. You're safe now," the ranger said soothingly, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "We'll get you to a hospital, and you can tell us everything there." As they carried me out of the forest on a stretcher, I caught one last glimpse of the deep, dark woods behind us. For a moment, I thought I saw a large, shadowy figure watching from between the trees. But then I blinked, and it was gone. I closed my eyes, exhaustion overtaking me. I knew that even though I had escaped the forest, my ordeal was far from over. The real challenge would be convincing others of what I had experienced, a battle I wasn't sure I was prepared to fight. I awoke to the sound of my own labored breathing, my body racked with pain in the fading daylight. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back. The hike, the attack, the creature. Bigfoot. The memory sent a fresh wave of terror through me, and I struggled to sit up, ignoring the protests of my battered body. "Easy there, ma'am," a voice said nearby. I turned to see the park ranger who had found me, kneeling beside me with a concerned look on his face. "Try not to move too much. The paramedics are on their way." I was lying on a stretcher just outside the tree line, the forest looming ominously behind us. A small group of search and rescue personnel milled about, speaking in hushed tones and casting worried glances in my direction. "The creature," I gasped, my voice hoarse from screaming. Did you see it?" The ranger exchanged a look with one of his colleagues before turning back to me. "Ma'am, we didn't see any creature. Can you tell us what happened?" I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "It was Bigfoot," I said, knowing how crazy it sounded even as the words left my mouth. "It attacked me on the trail. It was huge, covered in hair. It threw me against a tree and dragged me through the forest. I thought I was going to die." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the disbelief in their eyes mixed with pity and concern. They thought I was delirious or worse, lying. "Rachel?" the ranger said gently, using my name for the first time. "You've been through a traumatic experience. It's normal for the mind to play tricks on you in situations like this. Are you sure it wasn't a bear or a mountain lion?" I shook my head vehemently, immediately regretting it as pain shot through my neck. "No, you don't understand. It wasn't an animal. It walked on two legs. It had hands. It was intelligent and it was angry. Please, you have to believe me." But I could see that they didn't. The ranger patted my arm sympathetically. "Let's focus on getting you to the hospital, okay? We can sort out the details later." As if on cue, I heard the wail of sirens in the distance. The paramedics were arriving. I closed my eyes, fighting back tears of frustration. How could I make them understand what I'd seen, what I'd experienced? The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The paramedics arrived, asked me a barrage of questions, and loaded me into the ambulance. As we drove away from the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept imagining that I could see a large, dark figure moving among the trees following us. At the hospital, I was whisked away for x-rays and examinations. The doctors confirmed what I already knew. I had several cracked ribs, a sprained ankle, and a mild concussion, along with numerous cuts and bruises. They kept asking me what had happened, and each time I told them about the Bigfoot attack, I could see the skepticism in their eyes. "Ms. Turner," one doctor said as he checked my vitals, "I understand you believe you saw something in the forest, but are you sure it wasn't just a large animal? Perhaps the concussion is affecting your memory of the event." I gritted my teeth in frustration. "I know what I saw," I insisted. "It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was Bigfoot. Why won't anyone believe me?" The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse before responding. "Rachel, we're not saying we don't believe you experienced something traumatic. But Bigfoot, well, there's no scientific evidence to support the existence of such a creature. Is it possible that the stress of the attack is causing you to misremember details?" I wanted to scream, to make them understand, but I could see it was useless. They had already made up their minds. I was just another hiker who had a run-in with wildlife and let my imagination run wild. As night fell, I was left alone in my hospital room. The pain medication they'd given me dulled the physical aches, but did nothing for the emotional turmoil raging inside me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's face, felt its hot breath on my skin, heard its bone-chilling roar. A knock at the door startled me out of my thoughts. A police officer entered, notepad in hand. "Ms. Turner, I'm Officer Johnson. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened in the forest, if you're up for it." I nodded, sitting up straighter in the bed. Maybe, just maybe, he would believe me. "Of course, officer. What do you want to know?" He took a seat beside the bed. "Can you walk me through what happened, from the beginning?" I took a deep breath and recounted the events of the day, the peaceful start to my hike, the eerie silence that fell over the forest, and then the terrifying encounter with Bigfoot. I described the creature in as much detail as I could remember. Its massive size, the matted fur, the intelligent rage in its eyes. As I spoke, I watched the officer's face carefully. At first, he seemed interested, jotting down notes. But as I continued, I saw the familiar look of skepticism creep into his expression. When I finished, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ms. Turner, I appreciate you sharing your experience with me. We'll certainly investigate the area where you were found, but I have to ask, is there any chance you might have been using any substances before your hike? Anything that might have affected your perception?" I felt a surge of anger and frustration. "No, I wasn't on drugs, I wasn't drunk. I know what I saw, what I experienced. Why is it so hard for everyone to believe me?" Officer Johnson held up his hands placatingly. "I'm not accusing you of anything, ma'am. We just need to explore all possibilities. Attacks by unknown creatures aren't exactly common occurrences." I slumped back against the pillows, suddenly feeling exhausted. "I understand," I said quietly. "But I'm telling you the truth. That thing is out there, and it's dangerous. What if it attacks someone else?" The officer stood up, tucking his notepad away. "We'll increase patrols in the area and warn hikers to be cautious. That's the best we can do for now. Try to get some rest, Ms. Turner. We'll be in touch if we need any more information." After he left, I stared out the window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, Bigfoot was still roaming free, and no one believed me. The thought sent a chill down my spine. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The attack in the forest might be over, but a new battle was just beginning. The fight to be believed, to make sense of what had happened to me, and to come to terms with a world that suddenly seemed much larger and more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room made the whole ordeal seem like a surreal nightmare. I lay on the hospital bed, my body a canvas of pain, each breath a reminder of my cracked ribs. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils, a stark contrast to the earthy, wild scent that still lingered in my memory. The scent of Bigfoot. A nurse bustled in, her cheerful demeanor at odds with my somber mood. "How are we feeling, Miss Turner?" she asked, checking my vitals. I winced as I tried to shift into a more comfortable position. "Like I've been hit by a truck," I muttered. "Or thrown against a tree by a giant ape man." The nurse's smile faltered for a moment. "The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your injuries and treatment," she said, avoiding my comment about the ape man. "Try to rest until then." As she left, I closed my eyes, but rest wouldn't come. Every time I did, I saw those dark, intelligent eyes filled with primal rage. I heard the bone-chilling roar that still echoed in my nightmares. A soft knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. A middle-aged man in a white coat entered, a tablet in hand. "Miss Turner? I'm Dr. Ramirez. I've been reviewing your case." I nodded, bracing myself for the conversation I knew was coming. Dr. Ramirez pulled up a chair beside my bed. "You've sustained some significant injuries. Multiple contusions, 3 cracked ribs, a sprained ankle, and a mild concussion. Can you tell me what happened?" I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my chest. "I was attacked in Redwood National Park," I began, watching his face carefully. "By Bigfoot." To his credit, Dr. Ramirez's expression remained neutral. "I see. And can you describe this Bigfoot?" "It was massive," I said, the words tumbling out. "At least 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted fur. It had a face that was almost human, but not quite. And its eyes." I shuddered. They were intelligent, angry. It picked me up like I weighed nothing and threw me against a tree. Dr. Ramirez nodded, making notes on his tablet. "Ms. Turner, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes in high-stress situations, our minds can play tricks on us." "It wasn't a trick," I interrupted, my voice rising. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. Why won't anyone believe me?" The doctor held up a placating hand. "I'm not saying you didn't experience something frightening. Your injuries are very real. But perhaps it was a bear, or—" "It wasn't a bear," I shouted, then immediately regretted it as pain shot through my ribs. "I'm sorry," I said more quietly. "But I know the difference between a bear and what I saw. This thing walked on 2 legs. It had hands. It was intelligent." Dr. Ramirez sighed. "Rachel, may I call you Rachel? I'm going to be honest with you. Your physical injuries are consistent with an animal attack, but there's no scientific evidence to support the existence of Bigfoot. I'm concerned that the trauma of the attack, combined with your concussion, might be affecting your memory of the event." I felt tears of frustration welling up in my eyes. "So you think I'm crazy?" "Not at all," he said gently. "But I do think you might benefit from speaking with one of our psychiatrists. Traumatic events can have significant psychological impacts." I turned away, staring out the window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, that creature was still roaming free, and no one believed me. "I'll think about it," I said finally, not meeting his eyes. Dr. Ramirez stood up. "Get some rest, Rachel. We'll run some more tests in the morning, and then we can discuss your treatment plan." After he left, I lay in the darkness, every shadow seeming to move, every sound a potential threat. The hospital room felt claustrophobic, the beeping of machines a poor substitute for the natural sounds of the forest I once loved. Sleep came in fitful bursts, punctuated by vivid nightmares. In my dreams, I was back in the forest, running from an unseen pursuer. I could hear its heavy breathing, feel the ground shake with each of its steps. Just as it was about to catch me, I'd wake up, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Morning came, bringing with it a parade of doctors, nurses, and technicians. They poked, prodded, and scanned, asking the same questions over and over. With each retelling, The details of my encounter became hazier, but the terror remained crystal clear. A young intern was changing my bandages when she paused, a curious look on her face. "Ms. Turner," she said hesitantly, "these marks on your ankle, they're unusual, almost like handprints, but much larger than normal." For a moment, hope flared in my chest. "That's where it grabbed me," I said eagerly. "The Bigfoot, it's proof." The intern's eyes widened and she quickly finished her task. I'll mention it to Dr. Ramirez," she said, hurrying out of the room. But when Dr. Ramirez came to check on me later, he made no mention of the marks. Instead, he focused on my recovery plan and the need for physical therapy once my ribs had healed. As night fell again, I found myself alone in the room, the TV droning softly in the background. A news report caught my attention, a story about increased wildlife activity in Redwood National Park. Park rangers are warning visitors to be extra cautious following a series of unusual animal sightings, the reporter said. While officials stress that there's no cause for alarm, hikers are advised to stay on marked trails and report any strange encounters immediately. I leaned forward, my heart racing. Could it be? Were others starting to notice something was wrong in the forest? But then the report moved on to other news, and my brief moment of validation faded. I was left alone with my thoughts, my fears, and the growing certainty that even if I recovered physically, I would never be the same. As I lay in the hospital bed that night, every shadow seemed to hide the monster that had attacked me. The rational part of my mind knew I was safe here, surrounded by people and technology. But another part, a primal part awakened by my encounter in the forest, remained on high alert. I closed my eyes trying to find some peace, but the memory of those intelligent, rage-filled eyes haunted me. I knew that even though I had escaped the forest, my ordeal was far from over. The real challenge lay ahead, convincing others of what I had experienced and learning to live in a world that suddenly seemed much larger, much stranger, and much more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The morning light filtered through the hospital room window, casting long shadows across the sterile floor. I had barely slept, my mind replaying the horrific encounter in an endless loop. As I gingerly sat up, wincing at the pain in my ribs, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Sheriff Tom Hawkins. "Morning, Ms. Turner," he said, tipping his hat as he entered. "How are you feeling today?" I managed a weak smile. "I've been better, Sheriff. Thanks for coming." He pulled up a chair, his weathered face etched with concern. "I understand you've had quite an ordeal. Mind if we go over your statement again?" I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Of course. What do you want to know?" The local sheriff's patronizing tone as he dismissed my story made my blood boil with frustration. "Now, Miss Turner," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I know you believe you saw something out there, but are you sure it wasn't just a bear? We get a lot of those in the park this time of year." I gritted my teeth, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Sheriff, I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it was Bigfoot. It walked on two legs, it had hands, and it was intelligent. Why is that so hard to believe?" Sheriff Hawkins sighed, jotting something down in his notepad. "Rachel. May I call you Rachel? I've been policing these parts for over 30 years. I've heard all sorts of stories from folks who've had run-ins with wildlife. The mind can play tricks on you when you're scared." "But my injuries," I protested. "How do you explain those?" He shrugged. "Could have been a bear. Could have been a fall. The woods can be dangerous, especially if you're not prepared." I felt tears of frustration welling up in my eyes. I was prepared. I'm an experienced hiker. I know the difference between a bear and what I saw. The sheriff stood up, tucking his notepad away. "Look, we'll increase patrols in the area. Warn folks to be extra careful. But I can't go filing reports about Bigfoot attacks. It'd be the laughingstock of the department." As he left, I slumped back against my pillows, feeling utterly defeated. How could I make anyone understand what I'd been through? Later that afternoon, my best friend Sarah came to visit. I felt a glimmer of hope. Surely she would believe me. "Oh my God, Rachel," she exclaimed, rushing to my bedside. "I came as soon as I heard. What happened out there?" I took a deep breath and recounted my story once again, watching Sarah's face carefully as I described the terrifying encounter with Bigfoot. As I finished, I noticed Sarah's concerned looks and whispered conversations with the nurse behind my back. It felt like betrayal. "You don't believe me either, do you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated, then took my hand. "Rachel, honey, I believe that you believe what you saw. But Bigfoot? Are you sure it wasn't just a really big bear?" I pulled my hand away, anger and hurt welling up inside me. "Not you too, Sarah. I thought at least you would believe me." "I'm just worried about you," she said softly. "Maybe you should talk to someone. The doctor mentioned they have a great psychiatrist on staff." "I don't need a psychiatrist," I snapped. "I need someone to believe me." Sarah flinched at my outburst, and I immediately felt guilty. "I'm sorry," I said, deflating. I don't know how to make anyone understand." She patted my arm gently. "It's okay. You've been through a lot. Just focus on getting better, all right?" As Sarah left, I turned to stare out the window. The forest that I once loved now loomed as a constant threat, visible from my bedroom window. Each tree seemed to hide a potential monster, each shadow a lurking danger. That night I relived the attack in my dreams, waking up screaming and drenched in sweat. A night nurse rushed in trying to calm me down. "It's okay, Ms. Turner," she soothed. "You're safe here. It was just a nightmare." But it wasn't just a nightmare. It was a memory, vivid and terrifying. As I lay there in the darkness, my heart racing, I began to doubt my own memories. Was it possible that everyone else was right? Had my mind somehow twisted a bear encounter into something more fantastical? "No," I told myself firmly. "I know what I saw. I know what I experienced." The feel of its matted fur, the intelligence in its eyes, the incredible strength as it threw me against that tree, these weren't things my mind could have invented. The next morning, Dr. Ramirez came to check on me. "How are we feeling today, Rachel?" he asked, reviewing my chart. "Physically or mentally?" I asked wryly. He looked up, his expression serious. "Both, actually. I understand you had a rough night." I sighed. "I keep reliving it, Doctor. Every time I close my eyes, I see that creature." Dr. Ramirez nodded sympathetically. "That's not uncommon with traumatic experiences. Have you given any more thought to speaking with our psychiatrist?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to refuse again, to insist that I didn't need mental help. But another part, the part that was tired of fighting, of not being believed, wondered if maybe talking to someone might help. I'll think about it," I said finally. Dr. Ramirez smiled encouragingly. "That's all I ask. In the meantime, focus on your physical recovery. Your body needs rest to heal." As he left, I turned my attention back to the window, to the forest beyond. Somewhere out there, that creature was still roaming free. I knew it, even if no one else believed me. And as much as I tried to focus on my recovery, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The forest that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a looming threat. Each rustling leaf, each snapping twig in the distance sent a shiver down my spine. I began to doubt my own memories as everyone around me insisted it must have been a bear or a mountain lion. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist. And no matter how much others tried to rationalize it away, I couldn't forget the terror of that moment, the inhuman strength of the creature, the intelligence in its eyes. As night fell, I found myself staring out the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the forest. I knew that somewhere out there, Bigfoot was still roaming free. And even though I was safe in the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger and more terrifying than anyone could imagine. Desperation drove me back to the attack site, searching for any evidence to prove I wasn't crazy. Against medical advice and my own better judgment, I checked myself out of the hospital early in the morning. My body protested with every movement, but the need for validation overpowered my physical pain. As I stood at the edge of the Redwood National Park parking lot, my heart raced. The forest loomed before me, both familiar and alien. I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs, and started down the trail. "Ms. Turner," a voice called out. I turned to see Park Ranger Mike Johnson jogging towards me. "Should you be out here? I heard you were in the hospital." I forced a smile. "I'm fine, Ranger Johnson, just need some closure." He frowned, concern etched on his face. "I can't in good conscience let you go in alone, not after what happened. Mind if I join you?" Part of me wanted to refuse to conduct my search in private, but the rational part of my brain knew having a ranger along was safer. "Sure," I nodded. "I'd appreciate that." As we walked, I recounted my story once again, watching his face for any sign of belief. To his credit, Ranger Johnson listened without interruption, his expression neutral. "I know it sounds crazy," I finished, "but I know what I saw, what I experienced." He was quiet for a moment before responding. "I've worked these woods for 15 years, Ms. Turner. I've seen things I can't explain. I'm not saying I believe in Bigfoot, but I'm not saying I don't either." His words gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't entirely alone in this. As we neared the site of the attack, every snapped twig and disturbed patch of earth made my heart race, fearing the creature's return. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. "This is where it happened," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Right here." Ranger Johnson nodded, scanning the area. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Anything," I replied, desperation creeping into my voice. "Footprints, hair, broken branches. Anything to prove it was real." We began our search, combing the area methodically. Every few steps I found myself glancing over my shoulder, the feeling of being watched intensifying with each passing minute. "Ms. Turner," Ranger Johnson called out after a while, "come take a look at this." My heart leaped as I hurried over. Had he found something? But as I reached him, I saw only a set of unremarkable tracks in the soft earth. "Bear prints," he explained. "Probably what attacked you." I shook my head vehemently. "No, you don't understand. It wasn't a bear. It was bipedal. It had hands. It was intelligent." Ranger Johnson sighed. "Look, I know you believe what you saw, but..." "But what?" I interrupted, frustration boiling over. "You think I'm crazy too? That I imagined the whole thing?" He held up his hands placatingly. "That's not what I'm saying. Trauma can affect memory, that's all. And these woods can play tricks on the mind." I turned away, fighting back tears of frustration. As I did, a faint musky odor caught my attention. It was familiar, bringing back vivid flashbacks of the attack. My heart began to race. "Do you smell that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ranger Johnson sniffed the air. "Smell what?" "That musky scent. It's the same smell from when it attacked me." He shook his head. "I don't smell anything unusual. Maybe some deer musk, but that's common out here." I wanted to argue, to make him understand, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The same doubt I'd seen in the eyes of the doctors, the sheriff, even my best friend. As we continued our fruitless search, I felt like I was being watched as I scoured the area, finding nothing but my own paranoia. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. The forest that I once loved now felt hostile and terrifying. "Ms. Turner," Ranger Johnson said gently after another hour of searching, "I think we should head back. You're still recovering, and it's not safe to be out here for too long." I wanted to protest, to keep searching, but I knew he was right. My body ached, and exhaustion was setting in. With a heavy heart, I nodded. As we made our way back to the trailhead, the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Panic began to set in. What if we didn't make it out before dark? What if the creature was out there waiting? "Ranger Johnson," I said, my voice tight with fear. "We need to move faster." He looked at me, concern evident on his face. "Are you all right, Ms. Turner? We're almost there." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent my heart racing. I could almost feel the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck. As we finally emerged from the tree line, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The parking lot, with its mundane cars and informational signs, had never looked so welcoming. "Thank you for coming with me," I said to Ranger Johnson, my voice shaky. He nodded, his expression a mix of concern and something else, pity perhaps. "Ms. Turner, I know this experience has been traumatic for you, but I want you to know that these woods are safe. What happened to you was a terrible accident, but it was just that, an accident." I wanted to argue, to make him understand that what attacked me wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. But I could see in his eyes that it was useless. He'd already made up his mind. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Maybe you're right." As I got into my car, I caught a final glimpse of the forest in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement among the trees, a large dark shape retreating into the shadows. But when I blinked, it was gone. I started the engine with shaking hands, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the forest as possible. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. I had come looking for closure, for evidence to prove my story. Instead, I left with nothing but more questions and a deepening sense of isolation. The sun had set completely by the time I reached home, casting the world in darkness. As I fumbled with my keys, every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. I knew, logically, that I was safe here in the city, but the memory of those intelligent, rage-filled eyes haunted me. I stepped into my apartment, locking the door behind me and leaning against it, exhausted and defeated. The search for evidence had been a failure, leaving me with nothing but my own fragmented memories and a growing sense of doubt. As I collapsed onto my bed, still fully clothed, I knew sleep would be elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's face, felt its hot breath on my skin. And even though I was miles away from the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, some way it was still out there, watching, waiting. My encounter with Bigfoot had left me with more than just physical scars. It had shattered my understanding of the world, leaving me alone with a truth that no one else seemed willing or able to accept. As I lay there in the darkness, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Sleep eluded me as the night wore on. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those piercing, intelligent eyes of the creature that had attacked me. The memory of its hot, rancid breath and the bone-crushing strength of its grip sent shivers down my spine. I tossed and turned, my bruised body protesting with each movement. As the first rays of dawn crept through my window, I gave up on sleep entirely. My walls, once adorned with hiking photos and nature prints, were now covered with maps, photos, and news clippings, as I desperately sought validation for what I had experienced. I stood in front of the makeshift evidence board I'd created, my eyes tracing the red string connecting various points on the map where alleged Bigfoot sightings had occurred. My own encounter was marked with a large X, right in the heart of Redwood National Park. A knock at the door made me jump, my heart racing. "Rachel? It's Sarah. Can I come in?" I hesitated, then reluctantly opened the door. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in my disheveled appearance and the chaos of my apartment. "Oh, Rachel," she said softly, stepping inside. "What are you doing to yourself?" I turned back to my evidence board, gesturing wildly. "I'm close to figuring it out, Sarah. Look at this pattern of sightings. There's a clear migration route." Sarah gently took my arm, steering me away from the wall. "Honey, you need to rest. The doctor said you should be taking it easy." I shrugged off her hand, frustration bubbling up. How can I rest when that thing is still out there? when no one believes me. Sarah sighed, her face a mixture of concern and exasperation. We believe that you believe it, Rachel. But Bigfoot, don't you think that maybe, just maybe, the trauma of the attack is affecting your memory? I felt a surge of anger. Not you too, Sarah. I know what I saw, what I experienced. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was intelligent. It was... A monster? Sarah interrupted gently. Rachel, listen to yourself. You're talking about a creature that science says doesn't exist. I turned away, fighting back tears of frustration. Science once said the giant squid didn't exist either. Just because we haven't found concrete proof doesn't mean it's not real. Sarah was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was soft, hesitant. Have you considered talking to someone? A professional, I mean. The hospital recommended a therapist who specializes in trauma. I don't need a therapist, I snapped, whirling around to face her. I need someone to believe me. Sarah flinched at my outburst, and I immediately felt guilty. I'm sorry, I said, deflating. I don't know how to make anyone understand. She stepped forward, pulling me into a gentle hug, mindful of my injuries. We're just worried about you, Rachel. This obsession isn't healthy. As she held me, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. Dark circles under my eyes, hair unkempt, clothes rumpled. I barely recognized myself. After Sarah left, promising to check on me later, I found myself drawn back to the evidence board. My eyes landed on a blurry photograph, supposedly of Bigfoot. The figure in the image was indistinct, could have been anything. But I knew. I knew with a bone-deep certainty that this was real. I jumped at every sound, convinced that the creature was coming to finish what it had started. The hum of the refrigerator, the creaking of the building settling, even the distant sound of traffic, all of it set my nerves on edge. As night fell, I found myself peering out the window, scanning the street below. Every shadow seemed to move, every passer-by a potential threat. I knew logically that I was safe here in the city. Bigfoot couldn't come here. But logic had little sway over the primal fear that had taken root in my mind. Sleep became a luxury as I spent nights researching Bigfoot sightings and theories. I pored over cryptozoology forums, watched countless shaky videos purporting to show the elusive creature, and read every book I could find on the subject. My phone buzzed with a message from my boss. Rachel, it's been 3 days. When can we expect you back at work? Had it really only been 3 days since the attack? It felt like a lifetime. I ignored the message, turning back to my research. As the hours ticked by, I found myself spiraling deeper into my obsession. I began to see the creature's face in every shadow, every reflection, driving me to the brink of madness. Was this how it felt to lose touch with reality? A loud bang from the apartment above made me jump, my heart pounding. For a split second I was back in the forest, the creature looming over me. I shook my head, trying to clear the image. Get a grip, Rachel, I muttered to myself. You're safe here. But was I? The rational part of my brain knew that Bigfoot couldn't possibly be in the city, in my apartment building. But the part of me that had experienced its terrifying strength and intelligence wasn't so sure. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on my doors and windows. I pulled the curtains tight, not wanting to see the darkness outside. But even in the supposed safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As dawn approached once again, I sat at my desk, surrounded by printouts and scribbled notes. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I couldn't stop. I had to find proof, had to make someone believe me. My gaze fell on a map of Redwood National Park. The site of my attack was circled in red, a beacon drawing my attention. Despite the terror of my encounter, despite the disbelief of everyone around me, I felt an inexplicable pull back to that place. I need to go back, I whispered to myself, the realization both terrifying and exhilarating. I need to find proof. The logical part of my mind screamed that this was a bad idea. I was still recovering from my injuries, the creature was still out there. No one would believe me anyway. But the obsession had taken hold. I knew that I wouldn't find peace until I had concrete evidence of what I'd experienced, until I could prove to the world and to myself that I wasn't crazy. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone and pulled up the camera app. If I was going to do this, I needed to be prepared. I needed evidence that no one could deny. As I packed a bag with supplies, first aid kit, extra batteries, water, snacks, I felt a mix of fear and determination. I knew I was potentially putting myself in danger again, but the need for validation outweighed my fear. I paused at the door, taking one last look at my evidence-covered walls. I'll prove it, I promised myself. I'll make them believe. With that, I stepped out into the early morning light, my mind set on returning to the scene of my terrifying encounter. Little did I know that this decision would lead me into an even more harrowing experience, one that would test the limits of my sanity and my will to survive. Against all reason, I found myself drawn back to the forest, armed with a camera and desperate for proof. The early morning mist clung to the trees as I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot of Redwood National Park. My hands shook as I turned off the engine, the weight of what I was about to do settling heavily on my shoulders. I checked my backpack one last time. Camera, extra batteries, water, first aid kit. My ribs still ached from the first attack, a constant reminder of the danger I was willingly walking into. But I had to do this. I had to prove to everyone and to myself that I wasn't crazy. And as I approached the trailhead, a park ranger stepped out of the information booth. It was Ranger Johnson, the same one who had accompanied me on my failed search for evidence just days ago. "Ms. Turner?" he called out, surprise and concern evident in his voice. "What are you doing back here?" I forced a smile, trying to appear casual. "Just trying to face my fears, I guess." Ranger Johnson frowned, clearly not buying it. "I don't think that's a good idea, ma'am. You're still recovering, and after what happened, I'll be fine," I assured him, perhaps a bit too quickly. "I'm just going for a short walk. Clear my head." He hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but please stay on the marked trails. And take this." He handed me a park-issued emergency whistle. 3 sharp blasts if you need help." I thanked him and set off down the trail, my heart pounding with each step. The forest seemed different now, charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me flinch. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I found myself approaching the area where I had first encountered the creature. My palms were sweaty as I gripped my camera, ready to capture any evidence I could find. "You can do this, Rachel," I muttered to myself, trying to bolster my courage. "Just get the proof and get out." The snap of a twig behind me sent me into a panic. I fumbled with my camera as I spun around, my heart racing. For a split second, I saw nothing but trees and underbrush. Then movement caught my eye. Time seemed to slow down as I processed what I was seeing. Half hidden behind a massive redwood stood a hulking figure, its matted fur blending seamlessly with the bark. But what struck me most were its eyes, intelligent, fierce, and fixed directly on me. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I raised my camera with trembling hands, desperately trying to focus the lens. Come on," I whispered, willing the camera to capture the image. But before I could take the shot, the creature let out a bone-chilling roar that shook me to my core. It charged forward with impossible speed for its size, closing the distance between us in mere seconds. My scream caught in my throat as I turned to run. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the underbrush, blind panic driving me forward. I could hear the creature's heavy footfalls behind me, growing closer with each passing moment. "Help!" I screamed, remembering the whistle Ranger Johnson had given me. I fumbled for it, bringing it to my lips and blowing 3 sharp blasts. The sound echoed through the forest, but I knew help would never arrive in time. The creature was too close, too fast. In my haste to escape, I tripped over an exposed root and fell hard. I watched in horror as my camera flew from my hands, shattering against a nearby rock. My last hope for proof, gone in an instant. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain shooting through my ankle. But as I turned to run again, I found my path blocked by the massive form of Bigfoot. Up close, the creature was even more terrifying than I remembered. Its breath was hot and rank, its eyes filled with a primal rage that chilled me to the bone. I backed away slowly, my mind racing for a way out of this nightmare. "Please," I whimpered, knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself. "Please don't hurt me." The creature tilted its head, almost as if it understood my words. For a brief moment I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was capable of compassion. That hope was shattered as it lunged forward, its massive hand closing around my arm. I felt bones grind together under its grip and a scream of pain tore from my throat. With seemingly no effort, it lifted me off the ground. I kicked and thrashed, but it was like fighting against a mountain. The world spun as it shook me violently, my head snapping back and forth. Just when I thought it was going to crush the life out of me, a distant shout caught both our attentions. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, its grip on me loosening slightly. "Hello? Is someone there?" It was Ranger Johnson's voice, distant but growing closer. The creature growled, a low, menacing sound that vibrated through its entire body. Then, without warning, it threw me aside like a rag doll. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Through blurred vision, I saw the massive form of Bigfoot retreating into the forest, moving with shocking speed and agility for its size. "Ms. Turner, are you out there?" Ranger Johnson's voice was closer now, tinged with urgency. I tried to call out, but could only manage a weak groan. My body felt broken, every movement sending waves of pain through me. As I lay there struggling to stay conscious, I heard the sound of running footsteps approaching. Ranger Johnson burst into view, his face pale with shock as he took in my battered form. "Oh my God," he breathed, kneeling beside me. "What happened? Was it a bear?" I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of his question, but even that small action was too painful. "Not bear," I managed to gasp out. "Bigfoot. It was real." The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was the look of disbelief and concern on Ranger Johnson's face. Even now, even after this second attack, he didn't believe me. As consciousness slipped away, one thought echoed through my mind. I had come so close to getting proof, to validating my experience. But once again, Bigfoot had vanished, leaving me with nothing but more injuries and a shattered camera. The battle to be believed, I realized, was far from over. And as the world faded to black around me, I wondered if anyone would ever truly understand the terror I had faced in these woods. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I scrambled to my feet, running blindly through the underbrush. The creature's roars echoed through the forest, seeming to come from all directions at once. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder that I was still alive, still fighting. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. "Somebody, please help me." But I knew, deep down, that no help was coming. I was alone in this nightmare, pursued by a monster that shouldn't exist. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, leaving stinging cuts across my cheeks. My already battered body protested with each step, but fear drove me forward. I could hear the heavy footfalls of the creature behind me, growing closer with each passing second. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The massive form of Bigfoot was visible through the trees, moving with impossible speed and agility for its size. Its eyes, filled with primal rage, locked onto mine, and I felt a fresh wave of terror wash over me. "This can't be happening," I gasped, pushing myself to run faster. "This can't be real." But it was real. All too real. The pain in my body, the terror in my heart, the hot breath of the creature I could almost feel on the back of my neck. It was all horrifyingly real. I burst through a thick patch of undergrowth, momentarily losing sight of my pursuer. For a split second, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, I had lost it. That hope was shattered as a deafening roar erupted from right behind me. I screamed, the sound torn from my throat by pure, unadulterated fear. I could feel the creature's presence, massive and menacing, right on my heels. Its growls filled my ears, drowning out everything else. In my panic, I lost my footing on the uneven forest floor. Time seemed to slow as I fell, the ground rushing up to meet me. I hit hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Pain exploded through my already injured ribs, and for a moment, the world spun around me. No, 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 I whimpered, trying desperately to get back on my feet. But my body wouldn't respond, paralyzed by pain and exhaustion. I could hear the creature approaching, its heavy breathing growing louder. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die. But then, through the haze of pain and fear, I saw something that made my heart leap. The tree line. Just ahead, barely visible through the thick foliage, was the main road. With a surge of desperate energy, I forced myself to my feet. Every movement was agony, but the promise of safety, of escape, drove me forward. "Come on, Rachel," I gasped to myself. "You're almost there. Don't give up now." I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me, its roars filling the air. But I didn't dare look back. I focused everything I had on that thin strip of asphalt visible through the trees. With a final burst of speed, I broke through the tree line onto the main road. The sudden transition from dense forest to open space was jarring, but I didn't slow down. I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms frantically at an approaching car. "Stop!" I screamed. "Please stop!" The car's brakes screeched as it came to a halt just feet away from me. An older couple peered out at me, their faces a mixture of shock and concern. "Please," I gasped, stumbling towards the car. "You have to help me. It's right behind me." The woman in the passenger seat rolled down her window. "Oh my God, are you all right? What happened to you?" I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the trees, but the woods were still, no sign of the monster that had been pursuing me. I was attacked," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "Please, can you take me to the hospital?" The couple exchanged a worried look before the man nodded. "Of course, get in." As I climbed into the back seat, my hands trembling so badly I could barely manage the door handle, I caught a final glimpse of the forest. For a split second, I thought I saw movement among the trees, a large, dark shape retreating into the shadows. But when I blinked, it was gone. The car pulled away, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had escaped. I was safe. "What attacked you, dear?" the woman asked, turning in her seat to look at me. "Was it a bear?" I opened my mouth to tell them about Bigfoot, about the terrifying creature that had pursued me through the forest, but the words died in my throat as I saw the concern in their eyes. They would never believe me. No one would. I'm not sure," I said finally, slumping back against the seat. It all happened so fast. As we drove towards the hospital, I stared out the window at the passing landscape. The forest that had once been a place of peace and beauty now loomed as a dark, threatening presence. Somewhere in those woods, the creature was still out there, waiting, watching. I shuddered, wrapping my arms around myself. The physical wounds would heal, but I knew that the memory of this day would stay with me forever. The terror, the disbelief, the feeling of utter helplessness, it was all seared into my mind. As the hospital came into view, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief at the prospect of medical attention, of safety, but dread at the knowledge that once again, I would have to try to explain what had happened. And once again, no one would believe me. The car came to a stop in front of the emergency room entrance. As I stepped out, my legs shaky and weak, I turned to thank the couple who had saved me. "Are you sure you'll be all right?" the woman asked, her face creased with worry. I managed a weak smile. "I will be. Thank you. For everything." As they drove away, I stood there for a moment, staring back in the direction we had come from. The forest was no longer visible, hidden behind buildings and streets. but I could feel its presence, a looming threat on the horizon. With a deep breath, I turned and walked into the hospital. I knew that the coming hours would be filled with questions, with disbelief, with pitying looks from doctors and nurses who would try to rationalize what had happened to me. But I knew the truth. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt its breath on my skin, heard its roars echo through the forest. Bigfoot was real, and no matter what anyone else believed, I would carry that knowledge and the terror that came with it for the rest of my life. As the emergency room doors closed behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this ordeal was far from over. The creature had escaped, disappearing back into the forest without a trace, and I was left with nothing but my own fragmented memories and a body battered by an encounter that no one would ever believe. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room made me squint as I was wheeled in on a gurney. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils, a stark contrast to the earthy scent of the forest that still clung to my clothes. My body ached all over, a constant reminder of the terrifying encounter I had just escaped. "What happened to her?" I heard a nurse ask as they rushed me down the corridor. "Found her on the edge of Redwood National Park," one of the paramedics replied. "Says she was attacked by some kind of animal." I wanted to correct them, to tell them it wasn't just some animal. It was Bigfoot, but the words caught in my throat. I knew how it would sound. A doctor appeared at my side, shining a light in my eyes. "Ms. Turner, can you hear me? Can you tell me what happened?" I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I was attacked in the forest." "By what?" the doctor pressed. "A bear? A mountain lion?" I hesitated, then whispered, "Bigfoot." The doctor and nurse exchanged a look I had become all too familiar with, a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Let's get her to exam room 3, the doctor said, his voice carefully neutral, "and page psych for a consult." As they wheeled me into the exam room, I felt a surge of frustration. Once again, I found myself trying to convince skeptical authorities of what I'd seen and experienced. But how could I make them understand something I could barely believe myself? The next few hours passed in a blur of examinations, x-rays, and questions. So many questions. Each time I recounted my story, I could see the doubt growing in their eyes. "Ms. Turner," a kind-faced psychiatrist said, sitting beside my bed, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us in high-stress situations." I shook my head vehemently, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "It wasn't a trick. I know what I saw, what I experienced. It was real." The psychiatrist nodded sympathetically. "I believe that you believe it was real, but let's consider other possibilities. Could it have been a bear that your mind interpreted as something else?" I closed my eyes, fighting back tears of frustration. "No, you don't understand. It walked on 2 legs. It had hands. It was intelligent." "Rachel," he said gently, using my first name, "you've suffered a concussion, along with numerous other injuries. It's not uncommon for memories to be distorted in such circumstances." I turned away, staring out the window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, Bigfoot was still roaming free, and no one believed me. The pitying looks from the doctors as they suggested trauma-induced hallucinations cut deep. Without my camera or any physical evidence, I was left with nothing but my own fragmented memories. As the night wore on, I was moved to a private room. The pain medication they'd given me dulled the physical aches, but did nothing for the emotional turmoil raging inside me. A soft knock at the door roused me from my thoughts. Sarah, my best friend, peeked in. "Rachel, are you up for a visitor?" I nodded, grateful for a familiar face. Sarah rushed to my bedside, her eyes wide with concern. "Oh, Rachel, what happened? They told me you were attacked in the forest again." "It was Bigfoot, Sarah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just like before. But this time, I almost had proof." Sarah's face fell, and I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. "Rachel, honey, Don't you think maybe it's time to let this go? The doctor said you have a concussion. Maybe you're just confused about what happened. I felt a surge of anger. I'm not confused. I know what I saw. Why won't anyone believe me? Sarah took my hand, her voice gentle. We believe that you believe it, Rachel. But Bigfoot? It's hard to accept. I pulled my hand away, turning to face the window. Just go, Sarah. Please, I can't do this right now. After she left, I lay in the darkness, every shadow seeming to move, every sound a potential threat. The constant beeping of the heart monitor became a grim reminder of how close I had come to death. As life slowly returned to normal over the next few days, the constant fear of another encounter never truly faded. I found myself jumping at every unexpected sound, scanning every wooded area for signs of movement. A week after my release from the hospital, I sat in my therapist's office, recounting my experiences for what felt like the 100th time. Rachel, Dr. Anderson said, her voice calm and measured, have you considered that perhaps these encounters are a manifestation of some deeper fear or anxiety? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I know how it sounds, Dr. Anderson. I know that logically Bigfoot shouldn't exist, but I can't deny what I saw, what I felt. The terror was real. She nodded, jotting something down in her notebook. I don't doubt that your fear was real, but perhaps we need to explore why your mind might be creating this particular scenario. I stood up abruptly, pacing the small office. You think I'm crazy too, don't you? That I made it all up? Not at all, Dr. Anderson said soothingly. I think you experienced something traumatic, but sometimes our minds can interpret events in unexpected ways, especially under extreme stress. I slumped back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. So what do I do? How do I move past this if no one believes me? Dr. Anderson leaned forward, her eyes kind. We work through it together. We explore your feelings, your fears, and we find a way for you to feel safe again, regardless of what you believe happened in that forest. As I left her office, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me would always be back in that forest, running for my life from a creature that shouldn't exist. The memory of those inhuman eyes, filled with primal rage, was seared into my mind forever. Years later, I still wake up in cold sweats, the memory of those encounters as vivid as ever. The sound of snapping branches can send my heart racing, and I can't bring myself to hike in dense forests anymore. Life has moved on. I've changed jobs, moved to a new city, tried to put the past behind me, but there's always a part of me that remains hyper-vigilant, always watching, always waiting, because I know the truth. Bigfoot is real, and somewhere out there in the depths of the forest it's still roaming free. The world may not believe me, may never believe me, but I know what I saw, what I experienced, and that knowledge, that certainty, is both a burden and a strange kind of comfort. As I stand at my window, looking out at the city lights, I can't help but think of those dark woods. And I wonder, not for the first time, if somewhere out there, Bigfoot is looking back, remembering our encounters just as vividly as I do. The story of my Bigfoot attack may be over, but its impact on my life, on my very understanding of the world, will never truly end. It's a part of me now, as real and undeniable as the scars on my body. And no matter what anyone else believes, I know the truth. And that perhaps is the most terrifying thing of all.